Oregon, and 2003 PhD in Hispanic Studies from Berkeley, and a student of Professor Monroe. So I'm really glad to be able to kick off these proceedings. First, Professor Ignacio Navarrete has agreed to give a few opening words, and then Michelle and I will talk a little bit about the second edition of the book, and then we'll move on to our slates of speakers. So without further ado, let's see, Professor Navarrete, if you could just have a seat right there in that middle, yes, right there, and then I'm going to turn off my video and tilt the microphone over, since we're having a hybrid experience here, people. All right.
And I can introduce Ignacio.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and a special thanks to everyone who's joining us virtually. I was hoping to be there in person, but I got COVID, so I'm with everyone else in the virtual universe. But I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm also really thankful to Ignacio for joining us. He just flew in from London, so I'm sure he's quite tired. But he is, for those of you who don't know, Professor Navarrete. He's a professor of medieval and early modern Spanish literature, especially poetry, narrative, and poetics, and literary theory at UC Berkeley. He's just finished a book on narrative culture around 1520, as reflected in the printing of narrative works ranging from saints' lives to the Celestina. And he's published extensively on Spanish Golden Age lyric poetry and poetics. And again, thank you for kicking off this symposium.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to Berkeley, or at least in whatever form you are able to join us. It's a pleasure to host this event. I want to say a few words about what it has been like to be a colleague of Professor Monroe's. I remember meeting him very early in my time here in Berkeley when I was an assistant professor, and the welcoming presence that he extended to that he and his family extended to me and my family from the moment that we got here, including support at very crucial moments in my career when, well, those crucial moments in everyone's academic career. And a special, I feel like in a way I too have been a student of James Monroe's, because I have spent so much time in conversation with him over the years, and all the things that I have learned from him, the little tips I would get on the ring structure of the Libro de Buen Amor, or on the relationship of the Macama and the Picaresque, or of the similarities of the Villancico to Arabic lyric, are just lessons that have become crucial to me in my understanding of medieval and early modern Spanish literature. But the part that I have enjoyed the most have been joining him in the training of students, which is, after all, the best part of the career. And all the students that he has so graciously shared with me, of whom I particularly want to mention Douglas Young, because he's someone that those of us who knew him, we miss so much, both as academic, intellectual presence, but also as just like the wonderful person that he was. But Douglas, by no means the only one. And how much I have learned from being the outside reader of theses on so many fascinating topics, or participating as the outside member of PhD exams. And that may be considered academic service, but to me, it was a tremendous learning experience, and something that I treasure, and which once again has so much contributed to my understanding of medieval and early modern Spanish literature. So, I think I was just supposed to give a greeting here, and
It looks like you've done that. Yeah.
and I have done that, and I have done that, and so so I will now turn it over.
Okay. Thanks very much, Professor Navarrete, for those words. Michelle and I have a few things to say about the reissue of the book. And then we'd like to present to Professor Monroe a signed copy of the book from us to him with our dedication. And then we can move on to our slates of speakers. But Michelle, let's see, do you want to start, and then I will take off whenever you want to start talking.
Sure, I'll do the first half. We've been sort of frantically figuring out how to do this since I couldn't be there in person. I think we have it down, and thank you, Ignacio, for those opening words and for showing up when I know you have jet lag. All right, so welcome everyone again, and thank you to everyone here, both virtually and in person in Berkeley, who's helped to make the symposium happen, especially Nasser, who couldn't join us. He had an emergency in the middle of the night, and to Ignacio, as well as to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UC Berkeley. And after only 2 reschedules because of the craziness of COVID, we have managed to bring everyone together. Through apparently both COVID and construction. So our original location was moved last minute because of construction on campus. And we appreciate everyone's efforts. This symposium has been, as you all know, organized to reflect upon the reissue of Professor Monroe's Islam and the Arabs in Spanish Scholarship. David and I are both students of James's at Berkeley from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And while we could spend the next 30 minutes easily reminiscing about the many anecdotes and stories from that time, and it's been fun just to reflect upon them for me. Stories I remember James telling about everything from a Volkswagen Beetle in Franco, Spain, I believe, avocado trees in Chile, Castro's daily swims on the California coast, and in a story that proves that truth is often stranger than fiction, a conference on poetry organized by Saddam Hussein. And James, you can fact check me on any of those. Those are my reminiscences. We would like to take this opportunity, instead of reflecting on all of that, to reflect on the impact that the work has had on the field and on subsequent scholarship, aspects of which will also be touched upon and exemplified by the papers we will hear over the course of the symposium. We have both worked on this introduction, but we've had to rather arbitrarily split it into 2 parts. Let's see. Okay, James's study, Islam and the Arabs, appeared in print in 1970, at a time when cultural studies was in its infancy. James was very much ahead of his time. He anticipated and shaped the development of the field of medieval Iberian studies, but also in some ways anticipated the development of critical cultural studies in contemporary medievalism by choosing as his object the work of modern Spanish academics rather than medieval authors. The story of how James came to write the book bears repeating because it also speaks to the extent to which James was ahead of his time. As James relates in the opening note included in this reedition, as an undergraduate at the University of Houston, he was the student of Americo Castro, a Spanish scholar in exile from the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. Castro was the originator of the theory of convivencia, the idea that Spanish culture was the result of the mutual influence of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity during the medieval period. Castro argued that one could not understand Spanish history and culture without taking into account this influence. James was the only one of Castro's students to focus on the Arabic literature of Al-Andalus. And by the time James was applying to graduate school, he was already so convinced of the importance of Andalusi culture for understanding Spanish culture that he enrolled in a graduate program, not in Arabic or Near Eastern studies, but rather in the Department of Romance Languages at Harvard, where he wrote the first draft of Islam and Arabs and Spanish scholarship under the direction of the Hispanist Raimundo Lida, and pursued graduate work in Arabic literature with H.A.R. Gibb. James took his doctorate in 1963. Today, it would not be difficult to imagine a doctoral student in Spanish writing a dissertation on the history of Spanish Arabism. In 1963, it was practically unthinkable. James was not simply an outlier in his cohort. He was a bold innovator who was, even before earning his PhD, breaking disciplinary boundaries and writing a new critical history of Spanish Arabism. Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship is remarkable not only for its innovation in terms of methodological approach, proto-cultural studies, but also in that it has been and remains an inspiration for any number of future studies. And the talks we will hear today offer several examples of such studies, I believe. It has continued to inspire future studies and fields of inquiry because it is a critical intellectual history. In Islam and the Arabs and Spanish scholarship, James interrogates the political economy of Spanish Arabism against the backdrop of the turbulent political landscape of Spain in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Throughout Islam and the Arabs, James is attentive to the significance of Spanish politics on the texture of Spanish intellectual life, and in particular, as it applied to Arabism. The major difference between Spanish Arabism on the one hand and English and French on the other was that, in addition to the fact that Arabic had been the official and vernacular language of much of what was to become Spain, Christian Spain had long, if not always, entertained and sometimes indulged imperial and colonial designs on Arabic-speaking territories of North Africa ever since the conquest of Nasser Granada in 1492. The study of Arabic was not both a matter of national cultural history as well as half a millennium of imperialist and colonial expansion. And Dave, I'll turn it over to you if that's okay.
It
Does that
sounds
work?
like voice could use a little rest, yeah. Okay. While the title of the book is Islam and the Arabs in Spanish Scholarship, the work is really about Spaniards and their approach to the history and cultural production of Muslim Spain. In this study, James presents his readers with the story not only of prominent scholars, but also of institutions, archives, and the origins of a modern discipline, namely Spanish Arabism, that is still unfamiliar to many in the Anglophone world. Edward Said's foundational study, Orientalism, brought a fundamental awareness of how British and French scholarship shaped and determined those nations' colonial interests in the early modern period. However, as James points out quite presciently in the book, quote, "In the renaissance of Arabic studies in the West, the Spanish Muslims have too often been forgotten, for they have no petroleum interests, nor have they been a political menace since 1492. End quote. In the US, we're arguably in the midst of a second wave of growth in Arabic studies, as faculty and language instructors are hired to meet a growing demand for both basic Arabic language classes, as well as for advanced undergraduate and graduate curriculum. Exceptional, this is, in the current climate of crisis and austerity in which many other foreign language fields are shrinking and even disappearing. Making Monroe's book available in this reissue will allow English-speaking students and scholars to see that the story of how modern Arabic studies developed in Spain is an important chapter in the larger story of the field that it helped to create. In the book, James shows us how the field of Arabic studies in Spain, while transformed by pan-European intellectual movements such as the Renaissance, Enlightenment, Romanticism, and 20th century ethno-nationalism, nevertheless maintained a consistent focus on the role of Arabs and Islam in Spain's own past. At the heart of this struggle over the nature of Spain's Muslim or Arabic past is the question of who, in fact, are the Muslims of Spain. Are they Arab and Berber outsiders, or are they descendants of the Hispano-Roman and Celtiberian natives of the peninsula? No, natives in scare quotes and outsiders in scare quotes. As James shows us in the study, Spanish scholars from the 17th to 20th centuries approached the people, history, and cultural production of Al-Andalus according to the degree of Spanishness, and I say that with a nod to Stephen Colbert's truthiness, that they assigned to the Muslims of medieval Spain. In Monroe's consideration of the lived realities, scholarly training, and mentorship of some of the major figures of Arabic studies scholars in Spain, he reveals how that the position these scholars took on this question was intimately tied to their position concerning modern Spanish identity. Traditional Catholic nationalists, as Alejandro Garcia-San Juan will be telling us, tended to investigate the Muslims of Spain as religious, linguistic, and cultural others. Liberals inspired by positivist rationalism in the wake of the Enlightenment, however, tended to fall to the other extreme and claim Al-Andalus as a spectacular chapter in Spanish history. The reissue of this book will allow scholars new access to this study, which in the first edition was a relatively small run and went out of print a while back. Over 40 years, it's been increasingly difficult to locate copies of the book. Today, a search of abebooks.com, the website for independent bookstores, yielded 2 copies of the first edition for sale in bookstores in the UK and Belgium. One was priced at $539, the other at $79. I can't explain that price difference. More importantly, the Times have caught up with James. Edward, in a good way. I just realized usually when you say that, it means something bad. They're finally realizing how far ahead of his times he was. That's what I'm trying to say. Edward Said's 1978 work, Orientalism, catapulted the study of the West's engagement with Arab and Islamicate culture into the spotlight and inspired myriad responses and imitations, creating a whole field of critical Orientalism. In Europe, increased immigration from Arab and majority Muslim countries has brought the question of European Islam to the world's attention. In Spain, the 1978 transition to democracy and 1991 entry into the European Union and the growth of the economy had the effect of attracting increased immigration from Arabic-speaking and majority Muslim countries in North Africa in particular, making the question of the role of Islam and Arabic in Spanish life and the relationship of the Andalusi legacy to this contemporary reality quite real. And a couple of the papers you'll hear will address this. For the first time in half a millennium, there is again a significant population of Spanish Muslims, a good deal of them from Arabic-speaking backgrounds. The freedom of religion guaranteed by the 1978 Constitution means that Spanish citizenship is no longer restricted to Roman Catholics, but what that means for individual and collective national identity is still very much a matter of debate. In this context, in a political environment shaped by the unresolved and problematic transition from fascism to democracy, the meaning and value of Spain's Andalusi legacy is still very much in question. And closing up, in such an environment, it is important that those seeking a nuanced understanding of Andalusi culture and its legacy for modern Spain have access to the history of this enterprise. Contemporary attitudes toward the Andalusi legacy, toward Spanish Islam, toward the study of Arabic in Spain, and by extension in the European Union, are the product of centuries of academic and official Arabism. They are the product of half a millennium of deliberate decisions, selections, arguments, and omissions motivated by political, economic, religious, and social considerations. Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship is an early chapter in the historiography of this enterprise, unique for being written in English. We hope that future scholars will continue to follow the robust breadcrumb trail that James left for us in 1970. His accounting of the sources of the study of Al-Andalus and the genealogies and methodologies of Spanish scholars' engagement with it is a roadmap for future studies on the topic. Thank you, James, for your many contributions to the field and for being our teacher. And now I'd like to take a second to present James with a copy of the book that Michelle and I, well, I signed in her stead, but we're presenting it to him. Here it is. And I wrote a little inscription. You can't read it though. And then I'm going to present it to him. We're going to present it to him, right? I don't know. Can you see us? So James, thanks very much. So everything. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to help in this work. Thanks. Okay, Michelle, can you take us forward?
Yeah, I think I had built in a coffee and bagel break at this point because I thought it would be in person and I wanted a bathroom break as well as time to refuel on my coffee. So we have until 10 when we will start with the first panel. I did want to announce that this afternoon's panel will just have the 2 speakers because Nasser couldn't make it. So, but we will start that panel at the scheduled time. So everyone can take a break and we'll rejoin. I would ask though that the speakers on the first panel, Alejandro and anyone of the speakers who are using a PowerPoint, if you could come back like 10 minutes before, so we can just make sure that the screen share is working before 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. I know we're kind of all over the place. Someone's asking about the program. I will yeah, let me find the program. It may take me just a minute and I will put it on a PowerPoint and share it. So if we can leave Zoom open while we're on break, I will put the program up.
Okay. I'm going to pause the recording though.
Okay.
Okay. Hi everyone, we're back. Thank you for staying with us. Those of you that are still here. We are ready to begin our first panel after ironing out some technical difficulties. And I pass the mic over to Michelle Hamilton, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you. And thanks again to everyone for being here from various time zones. I was going to say in the US, but it's actually international. Our first speaker this morning, if you're in California, is Alejandro Garcia-San, who is currently a professor of medieval history at the University of Huelva. His main field of scholarship is medieval Iberia, with a special focus on Al-Andalus. Over the last years, he has worked extensively on the reception of Islamic Iberia and modern Spanish culture and scholarship, and the influence of nationalism in shaping popular myths and prejudices about the past, as mirrored in notions such as Reconquista and Muslim Spain. And the title of his talk today is Nationalism and Colonialism in Spanish Scholarship about Medieval Iberia.
Okay.
Sorry, before you start, are we going to do a Q&A for all 3 at the end of the panel or after each speaker, Michelle?
Let's at the end.
Okay, so we'll have a Q&A for all 3 speakers at the end of the panel. Thank you.
And hopefully Brian can make it.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen now. I wonder whether you can see it.
Yes, I can.
Okay, okay, fine. So, well, good afternoon from southern Spain. I wish I could be in California, but unfortunately, I'm here. At any rate, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this seminar. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity of being here today in the good company of friends and colleagues. So, yes, let's see. I'm trying to share my full screen. Okay, fine. Well, in their foreword to the recent re-edition of Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship, David Wacks and Michelle Hamilton claimed that while Monroe's book was too early to have engaged the explosion of post-colonial critical theory, so foundational to contemporary cultural studies, his account of Spanish Arabism is sensitive to the history of Spanish political and cultural institutions as implements of state control, and in particular to the way in which individual scholars' involvement with colonial politics have shaped the field. Spanish nationalism has a very long and deeply entrenched history in Spanish higher education. It was for many years the dominant strain of historiography in Spain. Taking as a starting point Monroe's pioneering approach to the influence of colonialism in Spanish Arabic studies, in what follows, I'll try to shed some light on the way in which nationalism and colonialism shaped most of the 19th and 20th century Spanish scholarship about medieval Iberia, including the work done by historians and Arabists. In 1978, Edward Said coined the notion of Orientalism to define the typically colonialist approach to the study of Arab societies. In his prologue to the Spanish edition of the book, he made two striking claims that drew my attention when I first read it. First, he complains he would have liked to have known more about Spanish Orientalism while writing his book, which is somewhat surprising considering that Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship originally appeared in 1970. Secondly, he looks at Spain as a remarkable exception in the European general context outlined in his Orientalism. While he acknowledges that the long and often complicated relationship between the ideology of Catholic Spain and the Judeo-Muslim past cannot be overlooked, neither downplayed, he claimed at the same time that in Spain, Islam would be a substantial part of Spanish culture and not a foreign and distant force to fight against, as if it were an invading army. Said's approach on Spain was way too optimistic and, to my mind, perhaps even misleading. Indeed, most of the academic work carried out in Spain about medieval Iberia across the 19th and the 20th century, and much of what has been written later, draws on nationalist and colonialist ideas. The two key notions that articulate the Spanish nationalist narrative about medieval Iberia, Reconquista, and Muslim Spain came up and consolidated in a social, political, and ideological context heavily influenced by nationalism and colonialism. Therefore, both notions are, to a large extent, the outcome of that context. The colonialist approach of Spanish nationalism concerns, on the one hand, the consideration of the Reconquista as an achievement of Western civilization. The liberal historian Modesto Lafuente, whose Historia General de España definitely consolidated the Reconquista in 19th century scholarship, developed a heavily loaded and biased conception of the Muslims, hampered by colonial prejudices about their barbarism and immutability. Across his long academic path, Claudio Sánchez Albornoz, in all likelihood the most influential and highly regarded 20th century Spanish historian, consistently featured the Reconquista as the re-establishment of Western civilization, thus confirming the colonialist leanings of the most outstanding Spanish scholarship back then. Unsurprisingly, this approach remains in force in certain current Spanish academic outlets. For instance, with regard to King Ferdinand III of Castile, the conqueror of Córdoba, Jaén, and Seville, featured as the king who brought these cities back into the Christian, European, and Western civilization. In line with the prejudices of the colonialist narrative, the Christian conquerors have often been described as liberators. This is the case, for instance, of a late 19th century statue of King James I of Aragon in Valencia, whose inscription reads that he entered Valencia victoriously, liberating it from the Muslim yoke. Well, it is worth noting that the expression Muslim yoke or Islamic yoke goes in tandem with the idea of liberation, obviously, aimed at describing the Muslims' presence as illegitimate and therefore meant to be cancelled. As put forward by its interpreters, the civilizing mission of the Reconquista would have essentially consisted on an evangelizing mission. And obviously the fact that this peculiar narrative was frequently the work of priests, monks, and devout Catholic authors could be hardly considered merely as a fluke. The role of faith-oriented or confessional scholarship in Spain remains largely unexplored so far. Suffice it to point out here the strong and frequently explicit Catholic bias of such well-known Arabists and historians as the Carlist Francisco Javier Simonet, the priest Miguel Asín Palacios, or Friar Justo Pérez de Urbel, to name just a few of a long list that includes many others. Well, the narrow relationship between Spanish nationalism and Reconquista peaked under the Franco regime, eliciting the unanimous and invaluable support of the Catholic hierarchy. Franco consistently disguised his coup d'etat against the Republic as an evangelizing mission, branding it as a crusade and a new Reconquista against the Reds, the atheists, and the Freemasons. The Reconquista played a decisive role in legitimizing Franco's victory, as eloquently expressed by newspaper ABC on the occasion of its 8th anniversary on April 1, 1947. As pointed out by Francisco Garcia Fitz in his 2010 monograph on the Reconquista, this notion ended up being a highly valued notion to national Catholicism, not only as an integral part of the official Francoist scholarship, but as a critical tool for the indoctrination of the Spanish society at the early stages of the regime. In line with the most radical Catholic outlets, Franco made the most of the traditional notion of Reconquista and weaponized it for his own benefit. It holds likewise truth, however, that Reconquista has proven a highly adaptive and customizable ideological weapon, as useful for legitimizing Franco dictatorship as for legitimizing democracy or even women's rights. In fact, as I'm planning to show next, Francoism compellingly proved that Reconquista and the apparently opposite notion of Muslim Spain were mutually compatible. This mutual compatibility is hardly surprising, since much like the Reconquista, Muslim Spain was originally the brainchild of Spanish nationalism, heavily hampered by the permanent suspicion of devoting their efforts to the study of Islam. In an overwhelmingly Catholic environment, Spanish Arabists had to strive to earning their place in the sun. The strategy basically consisted on turning Al-Andalus into something palatable for Spanish nationalism. Rather than the result of a foreign influence, the main literary, artistic, and architectonic achievements of the Muslims would have been the product of the local Hispanic genius. By grounding the full Spanishness of the great intellectual figures of Al-Andalus on notions such as Hispano-Árabe, España Árabe, and España Musulmana, the Arabists did finally fit in the margins of 19th century Spanish scholarship. Well, Francoist national Catholicism compellingly proved that Reconquista and Muslim Spain could be fully compatible. In order to achieve his new reconquest of Spain from the hands of the Reds, Franco drew substantial military support from the Berber troops coming from the Spanish protectorate in northern Morocco. The participation of Muslim forces in Franco's crusade looked contradictory enough as to require some sort of intellectual justification. In line with the arguments later developed by Asim Palacios in a well-known article, Franco himself proclaimed in 1937 the full and traditional mutual understanding between Spain and Islam. Well, affirming the Spanishness of Al-Andalus ran parallel to de-Arabizing it. As shown by a recent article by Juan Pablo Domínguez, Arab Spain was made progressively redundant in favor of Muslim Spain. This process developed within an ideological framework in which racial theories claiming the cultural inferiority of the Semites gained traction. Julián Rivera, who was Francisco Codera's main pupil and his successor as the most influential Spanish Arabist, stands as one of the most vocal representatives of this tendency. Rivera ruled out any hint of Arab influence in Al-Andalus. Quote, "The Arab element hardly entered the social chemistry of Spanish Muslims. The best name to be given to them is not Arabs, but Spaniards." End quote. Being the leader of Spanish Arabic studies in his time, the contribution of Rivera turned out to be decisive in replacing Arab Spain by Muslim Spain. Renaming the native reality represents one of the most typical features of the colonialist mindset. Through this reassignment, the colonizer takes over the native reality and becomes a sort of bestower of new identities. From this perspective, naming Al-Andalus as Muslim Spain and calling into question or just denying its Arab social, linguistic, and cultural features is an act of colonialist scholarship that has likewise been viewed as an expression of anti-Semitism. While this is perhaps the case of Sánchez Albornoz, at least judging from British Spanicist Peter Russell, although the truth is that his charge of anti-Semitism came with regard to Albornoz's remarks about the role of the Jews in medieval Iberia, rather than for asserting emphatically that the Hispanic vital contexture is not Arabized. Not by chance, the tendency to de-Arabizing Al-Andalus culminated with fascism, the ideology that over the first half of the 20th century made the most of all the genocidal potential held by anti-Semitism. British-German Nazi ideologist Houston Stuart Chamberlain claimed in his 1899 book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, that, quote, "The noble Moor of Spain is anything but a pure Arab of the desert. He is half a Berber from the Aryan race, and his veins are so full of Gothic blood that even at the present day, noble inhabitants of Morocco can trace their descent back to Teutonic ancestors." Well, to be sure, the best Spanish proxy of this fascist connection is the Basque amateur historian Ignacio Olagüe, a close friend of Ramiro Ledesma, the founder of the earliest fascist Spanish political organization, and a devout follower of German philosopher Oswald Spengler, a well-known admirer of Mussolini. Olagüe took the de-Arabization of Al-Andalus to its most delusional extreme, claiming that, yes, les Arabes n'ont jamais envahi l'Espagne. Published with the invaluable help of the well-known French historian Fernand Braudel, Olagüe's book sets out to prove the extravagant claim made in its eye-catching title, as pointed out by James Monroe in his 1975 review, in which he likewise claimed that Olagüe bring us, quote, into the familiar realm of the Semitic plot that plagues much of Spanish historiography. Okay. Only a year on the publication of Monroe's review, the decolonization process of Al-Andalus started out thanks to the work done by the late French medievalist Pierre Guichard. To my mind, his Al-Andalus, estructura antropológica de una sociedad islámica en Occidente, ushered in the modern scholarship of Al-Andalus. The colonizing Al-Andalus first began with the restitution of that name as the most accurate designation of the land inhabited by Iberian Muslims. Certainly, Guichard was not the first in using it as an academic concept, but he did it within a fresh approach. By heavily and consistently criticizing traditional Spanish scholarship, Guichard not only paved the way for demolishing the idea of Muslim Spain, but likewise allowed a much more refined understanding of Al-Andalus. Although 46 years had gone since Guichard's book, the colonizing Al-Andalus is yet to be finished. Actually, in 2006, coinciding with the 30th anniversary of Guichard's landmark book, Eduardo Manzano sent a stark warning about the rising up of the unspeakable conservative reaction fueling an inflammatory Reconquista ideology that seemed definitely cornered. Unfortunately, the course of events over the last 16 years has fully endorsed his pessimistic forecast, not only in scholarly, but likewise in non-scholarly outlets. In fact, not only Reconquista remains today the hallmark of Spanish nationalist scholarship, but in line with the Francoist tradition, they're weaponizing it to tell apart the good Spaniards from the bad ones. Well, rather than a merely local issue, this conservative reaction is part of a much larger process in which the Reconquista has become an ideological icon of the Western civilization. According to American historian Stanley Payne, for instance, the Reconquista was such a great and singular feat that only for this reason the history of Spain is totally different from all the rest. Well, what is much worse, rather than a merely scholarly issue, the resurrection of the most ideological version of the Reconquista is loaded with potentially devastating consequences. As shown by some recent and extremely dramatic events, Reconquista has of late turned into a rallying cry among white supremacist outlets. Okay, I'm winding up this talk with a final remark. If Muslim Spain can arguably be considered today an outdone concept, Reconquista, conversely, not only has not been driven out of the academic conversation, but has gained unprecedented traction since the Francoist period. The traditional notion of Reconquista still stands as a grim scholarly legacy that lingers on, And therefore, the colonizing medieval Iberia has yet a long way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to really quickly try to move this computer over to be able to plug it into a larger screen. So just stand by, Brian, for 1 second, okay?
Not a problem.
Can you say a word or two?
A word or two.
Hey,
No.
The volume out is still, okay, that's good enough. All right.
Should I start?
Yeah, we now have the speaker projected on the wall in a proper.
Okay.
Everybody here can see, yeah. So go ahead. Please introduce, please introduce.
Okay. Thank you, Alejandro. That was a great paper. And again, we decided we'll take questions at the end. So our next speaker is Brian Catlos, who is a professor of religious studies at Colorado University, Boulder, and a research associate in humanities at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His recent publications include Kingdoms of Faith, A New History of Islamic Spain, and a forthcoming study with Berman and Meyerson in this year, right? The Sea in the Middle, the Mediterranean World from 650 to 1650, as well as Text from the Middle, Documents from the Mediterranean World, both with the UC Press. And again, those are his most recent publications, but he has extensive articles and says on medieval Spain. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Michelle. Your audio was breaking up a little bit for me, so I hope you guys can hear me, and I trust you can see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing. So before I start, let me preface my short presentation by thanking David Wacks and Michelle Hamilton for organizing this event and express my regret at not being able to schedule a trip to Berkeley to deliver this talk in person and to celebrate personally with James, who I trust is in the room, and the many dear colleagues presenting here the commemoration of Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship, a watershed study that was not only original and necessary, but prefigured in some ways the following 5 decades of scholarship on medieval Spain, and now re-edited with a masterful preface by David and Michelle. So I wasn't really sure what to prepare, but after talking with our esteemed organizers, they suggested something in a celebratory spirit rather than an academic talk, pura y dura, would be appropriate. And so on that note, and perhaps a more optimistic note than Alejandro, I'll proceed. Naturally, I had read James's work as a graduate student, but it was only sometime after 2002 that I had the opportunity to meet him in person. By that time, I was a new faculty member in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, when James reached out to invite me together with my family, which together with my wife, Nuria, then included my daughter, Alexandra, of 1 or 2 years, to come visit him and Julianne in Berkeley for lunch one Saturday afternoon. When one is a young scholar and has the opportunity to meet someone who is una figura in person, I think one cannot help but feel a mixture of trepidation and abashment. But our visit was a pure delight. They welcomed the 3 of us into their home and we spend a relaxed and enjoyable afternoon with excellent food, fine wine, and superlative company, and bread cut with a knife that had belonged to Americo Castro. Imagine that. Discussing themes both scholarly and personal. We were utterly charmed, as was our infant daughter, who James and Julianne provided with some of their own, by then adult sons' toys to play with while we chatted. Alexandra, my daughter, was so taken by one in particular, a rather outsized set of quite distinctive and quite antique alphabet blocks, that they insisted she take them home as a gift, and a welcome one. With no extended family in the US, Alexandra was a little bit short on toys. Now, I mention this not only to cite a reflection of James's generosity, but because I don't think I ever told him that a year or two after that, his son Cameron was hired as an anthropology professor at UC Santa Cruz and became a friend. And one afternoon, Cameron had come over to my place for a visit, and he spotted my daughter happily playing with those blocks. And he said with wistful nostalgia, "Wow, I used to have a set of blocks just like that." And after a somewhat awkward pause, I was forced to confess, "Actually, Cameron, those are your blocks." And the look on his face was one of shock, dismay, and utter surprise. So I'm sorry, James, that I gave you up. I hope that Cameron forgave you. I regret betraying you, but at that point, getting those blocks away from my daughter would have been quite impossible. So I've got that off my chest now. So looking at the scholarship of medieval Spain today, it's hard to imagine a time when the history of Al-Andalus and Arabic culture was seen as something exceptional or anomalous in the history of Spain and Europe, particularly now when this has become, for so many people, whether scholars, the public, or local tourist boards, emblematic of medieval Spanish history, and is rightly seen as essential to the formation of Spanish culture. And I just wanted you to check out actually the only slide on my PowerPoint, which is this well-meaning but somewhat problematic illustration of convivencia, which I encountered at the Municipal Museum in Hita. And it's very well-meaning, but there's a lot to deconstruct there. And it reminds me of, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the Three Stooges, but when I see this picture, I always expect the Templar in the middle to be laughing with these guys and then suddenly knock their heads together. But anyways, there you go. So thanks to the work of so many scholars around the world, but here in North America, James is one of those who clearly stands out. Andalusi Arabic culture has been dragged out of the footnotes and into the master narrative, and knowledge of Arabic and Andalusi culture is no longer that dusty preserve of philologists, but an essential part of the toolbox of anyone who seeks to write authoritative scholarship on the peninsula in the pre-modern era. It's thanks in no small degree to his tremendous output, not only as a scholar, but as an editor and translator of primary source material, of course, as a teacher and supervisor of a generation of graduate students, that this transformation has taken place. And how the field has been transformed. It's both heartening and unnerving to see how well prepared linguistically so many of our graduate students and younger scholars are today, with a confident command not only of Spanish and Latin, but Arabic or Hebrew in both, that enables them to engage in work that before would have been impossible before this revolution took place. I also feel something of retroactive relief that my own entree into the scholarly world came a few years prior to this, so I didn't have to compete with the eminently better prepared and more skillful young scholars that are being produced today. This is very exciting because effectively whole new panoramas of scholarly work have been opened up, and not only in the sense that Arabic and Islamic culture of Spain is now firmly established as not only a legitimate but necessary field of study, but because the way we think about Spanish history has been changed as a result. Old cobweb truisms of Islamic conquest and occupation and Christian unity and reconquest are being blown away, perhaps not as quickly as some of us might like, but also chronologies that for so long bracketed both Spanish and European medieval history, 711, 1492, and so on, are now seen less as catastrophic ruptures and more as points on continuums of change, markers in historical processes that began earlier and continued much later than those red letter dates would lead us to believe. The notion that Christian Spain and Islamic Spain embody two historical actors engaged in some operatic civilizational struggle now appears laughable when once it appeared to be established fact. The Janus-faced nature of Spanish history is now indisputably recognized. Islamic aid and Christian Spain are in many contexts two expressions of a single historical reality. Interdisciplinarity has gone from being a curiosity to an aspiration and finally to reality, as it is seen as absolutely necessary to combine perspectives from literary and historical studies, not to mention cultural studies, musicology, archaeology, material culture, anthropology, and so on, in any comprehensive work on Spanish history. Now, I'm not suggesting that James was single-handedly responsible for this transformation, but his work was essential to the processes that brought about this change. Thanks in no small measure to his work and that of his scholarly generation, our view of the pre-modern Spanish culture was deprovincialized and became cosmopolitan. One consequence of this has been, at least from the North American perspective, the increasing integration of Spanish history into the framework of European medieval and early modern history. Whereas until recently, the core narrative of medieval Europe was really anchored in England, France, Germany, and Northern Italy, and everywhere else was seen as peripheral and exceptional. Spain is now seen as comprising a normal and significant part of the medieval European meta-narrative. Part of this is due to the fact that historians of Europe, thanks to the work of scholars of Spanish Islamic culture, can no longer deny or ignore the crucial, essential role that Arabic letters played in the formation of European culture, science, and literature. I don't think there's any need to rehearse the details of this, but now it's unthinkable to construct a history of Western science and learned culture without Spanish Islam. This has been supported also by parallel developments in Jewish studies, which has come to recognize the essential role played not only by Spanish Jewish culture, but Islamicate Jewish culture in particular in the meta-narrative of Jewish history. And of course, Andalusi Jewish and Islamicate culture and history are also inextricably bound up to children of the same womb. Finally, a larger interest in the academy, in broadening or globalizing medieval history, and in particular of incorporating Islamic history into these larger narratives, has also served to integrate Spanish and Andalusi history in this way. To some extent, these developments are also due to tectonic shifts in the field of medieval studies, driven by a combination of the demographic diversification of the scholars engaged in medieval studies and the students they teach, and this quest by scholars to find new sources and fresh grounds of inquiry. Since the post-war period, the North American Academy is no longer the preserve of middle and upper class white Protestant men, and consequently the pride and prejudices that resulted from the privileging of Anglo-centric historical narratives have been challenged and are dissipating. The long shadow of the Black legend is retreating, and the dismissal of Spain as particular and the Catholic world in general is superstitious, retrograde, and incidental to the processes that led to modernity have lost their currency. At the same time, the study of Islamic culture and Spanish history is broken free of its philological and Orientalist straitjackets, and Spanish Arabists, armed with the finely honed linguistic skills that are the heritage of those philological beginnings, are carrying out historical studies of both technical virtuosity and bracing originality. Most significantly, the scholarship of Spanish Islam is now finally working beyond its own interior prejudices, notably the anti-Berberism that was uncritically assimilated by many Arabists who unquestioningly echoed the prejudices of their beloved Andalusi sources. And I'm talking about you, Ibn al-Astarqui. But if, on the other hand, Spain's role as part of the normative history of medieval West has been recognized, Spain's exoticism, exceptionalism, and uniqueness is now being reconsidered. 20th century national historians lauded Spain's Islamic past and presented Spain as unique in Europe as a land of three religions. Convivencia came to be seen as something uniquely Spanish, as was mudejarismo. And the intimate synthesis of Jewish and Islamic culture that was so essential here was seen as something specific to Spain. Now we realize that this was not the case. While these dynamics were perhaps most strong, most durable, and most evident in the history of Spain, they were not at all unique to the peninsula. We can observe similar dynamics, not only in short bursts in places like southern Italy and Sicily or the Latin East, but playing out across the Mediterranean world over 10 centuries of a long Middle Ages that stretched from the mid-7th to the mid-17th century. Thus, Spanish scholarship has helped to drive and has been drawn into the emerging field of Mediterranean studies, which invites scholars to engage in interdisciplinary and comparative research unhindered by the taxonomical prejudices of the Academy of the Age of Nationalism. Neither Latin Christendom, Byzantium, and the Islamic world, nor the Jewish world that intersected them are seen as clearly bounded, distinct, and incompatible cultural spheres. Rather, the Mediterranean is increasingly recognized as a cultural, political, economic, and social environment which bound them together, and through mutual intelligibility provided a forum for multivalent currents of acculturation and for political, economic, and social integration, whether that took place in the context of collaboration or of conflict or of both. Speaking for myself as co-founder and co-director of the Mediterranean Seminar, it's been thrilling to have a ringside seat to this scholarly reorientation. Similarly, one sees a growing recognition by scholars of both Spain and North Africa, whether they hail from these regions or from the larger Anglo-European world, that the Straits of Gibraltar do not constitute a barrier or endpoint, but a bridge, and that the history and culture of the Maghreb and the Iberian Peninsula are densely entangled, both prior to the Arab-led conquest of Hispania right through to the present day. This is reflected in the success of initiatives like SNAP, the Spain North Africa Project, as well as a whole gamut of projects, institutes, journals, book series, and scholarly forums that are committed to integrating Islamicate history in both the history of Spain and Europe and vice versa. Thanks to these movements, many scholars now rightfully recognize not only that Spain was part of the historical West, but that Islamic Spain in particular and the Islamic world in general were integral to the historical processes that united these territories from the Indus to the Atlantic and from the Niger to the Baltic as they laid the foundations for what would become the modern West. So standing here in 2022, or actually sitting here, I guess, looking back 50 years to the publication of Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship, we see the beginnings of a scholarly revolution, one in which James Monroe was certainly not the only voice. Revolutions are only successful when they engage with a multiplicity of actors and agendas, but certainly he was a crucial one. Although it looked back at the origins of Spanish academic perspectives on the history and culture of Islam, it very much helped set the agenda for the next 50 years, laying the foundations for a scholarly turn that eschewed provincialism, Orientalism, and the providentialism of the centuries previous, and invited us as scholars to take a more detached and embracing view of the history and culture of Islamicate Spain. Looking forward, the panorama is no less inspiring as scholars in Spain and Latin America, Europe, the Anglo-American world, and Asia emerge ever better trained to undertake the comparative work, which is crucial to understanding both the Christian and Islamic West and the relationships that bound them together. What would I hope to see? I'd like to see more of the voices of historians and scholars from the Arab world joining these historical discussions. Language, academic culture, and economic challenges have all impeded this, but there are hopeful signs, particularly as European scholars have become more successful at building collaborative bridges with scholars in places like Morocco and Tunisia. Digitization is going to help this too, I think. Say what you like, but oft-maligned sites like ResearchGate and academia.edu bring a whole world of scholarship to scholars in these countries and across the developing world who could not otherwise hope to access research materials, and even the much-hated Zoom. Although a greatly imperfect alternative to in-person meetings, has enabled scholars from developing countries to participate in and attend scholarly meetings and invite scholars to give talks to their audiences that otherwise would not have been possible. Scholarship is enriched by a diversity of voices and opinions, so these are promising developments indeed. So altogether, despite the rather gloomy prognostications regarding the future of academia in general and the humanities in particular, we're now in an era of incredible scholarly production in terms of diversity, originality, and quantity. And it's our task as scholars not only to carry out such work, laboring in the trenches, but to bring these perspectives to wider audiences, both among scholars and a broader public, much in the spirit of James's work, now half a century old, but still not only relevant, but important. So thank you, James, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Michelle.
I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry if I'm breaking up. Normally I would go to my office, but I can't leave my house. And so hopefully you hear me. Thank you so much, Brian, for a lot of food for thought. Our next speaker is Cristina Sivantos. Can you hear me? I just got a message that I'm unstable, but or my internet connection is unstable. Cristina. Okay. Cristina also got her PhD at Berkeley in 1999 and worked with James. And she's currently a professor at the University of Miami, where she teaches Hispanic and Arabic literary and cultural studies. Her research focuses on Arabic-speaking immigrants in Hispano-America and Spain, South-South relations between Latin America and the Arab world, empire and coloniality, nationalisms, language ideologies, memory studies, and tolerance. She is the author of Between Argentines and Arabs, Argentine Orientalism, Arab Immigrants, and the Writing of Identity. from 2006. She's also the author of The Afterlife of Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia and Contemporary Arab and Hispanic Narratives from 2017. And most recently, congratulations, in 2022, Jamón and Halal, Lessons in Tolerance from Rural Andalusia, as well as numerous essays. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me try and share my screen. Okay, great. So thank you for this opportunity to share my work. And thanks to Michelle and David for their organizing, especially in the face of so many hurdles. So I'll be talking today about how James Monroe's Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship continues to have an impact on the study of a remote but very paradigmatic corner of Spain, and on the very close at hand issue of tolerance. And I will be attempting to summarize the findings of, a whole book project. So please bear with me if I'm making big jumps, and hopefully in the Q&A, you'll be able to resolve any lingering questions that may have arisen. So let me put this into present mode. There we go. Okay. This is the story of Spanish scholarship and popular narratives about the Alpujarra region within Andalusia, and how these narratives condition contemporary perspectives on the region, creating a vision of it as stuck in its Moorish past, to such an extent that even when the diverse contemporary human geography of the region is acknowledged, it's framed as a facile convivencia, one based on a simplistic understanding of tolerance. Scholarship and literary narratives about the region tend to link it to the cultural confluence of Al-Andalus. And just to pause for a minute, this is a map that shows, so the larger area in yellow is the broader region or autonomous region of Andalusia, and the little area in red is the region known as La Alpujarra. And you can see in the inset where that fits into Spain, in case you're still not placing it. I'm also going to be making a lot of reference to a town called Orgiva, which is known as the capital of the Alpujarra. And you can see there on the map, one marker is for the city of Granada and the other is for the town of Orgiva. So a lot of the phenomena that I'm going to be describing, they have their epicenter in the town of Orgiva itself, which is, according to the official number of registered inhabitants, it has about 6,000 inhabitants, but estimates are that there's actually 8,000 people living in the area. So more recently, the Alpujarra has been the site of other types of cultural contact, and Orgiva itself has been represented via memoirs and various television shows. So in this project, taking Orgiva as a case study, I have two goals. One is to situate the latest written and television narratives about the town against the backdrop of earlier narratives and analyze the portraits of Orgiva that they offer. And the other is to examine, in light of the silences in these recent narratives, the workings and texture of coexistence in the town, including its tensions and conflicting stories, by means of the narratives that those who live in the town tell about it. So I use a combination of written and textual analysis of written and textual narratives, and also oral narratives that I gathered through fieldwork. So although I won't be getting into this aspect of it here, another thread within this story is how I came to tolerate the different groups that converge in Orgiva, which happens to be the town from which my father hails. To provide more of the historical framework, under Umayyad rule, Berbers and also some Arabs slowly settled the Alpujarra. But then it became an area of primary focus between the fall of Granada in 1492 and the final expulsion decrees in the early 1600s. when the Alpujarra had a prominent role in Spanish history as the site of the final stage of the Reconquista. So it was the first site of exile for Boabdil, the famous last Muslim ruler of Al-Andalus, and also the last site of Muslim uprisings against the Catholic monarchs in what's known as the rebellion of the Alpujarras in the 16th century. So when the Castilians quashed that rebellion, that has been seen as the final blow of the Reconquista. But the area has been the subject of many legends regarding a lasting Moorishness, whether in the sense of actual North Africans who managed to linger in the area, evading the expulsion decrees and the Inquisition, or simply a cultural imprint that was left in this remote area. So given the Alpujarra region's particular and evolving role in Spanish cultural history, there are layers of narratives about the region and the town of Órgiva. Historically, the Alpujarra has been the site of the entrance and exit of various empires, an intercultural contact portrayed particularly in the works of historical fiction about the Moorish other. This historical backdrop is still present in the body of written narratives, including European and Spanish travel narratives, memoirs, novels, and anthropological studies about the Alpujarra. And more recently, in television episodes about the town itself, as well as in some present-day community members' narratives about the area. So this is, again, the idea of enduring Muslim communities that are hidden in these mountain valleys. Although within Europe, Spain's Europeanness, in quotes, is questioned, within a national framework, that element that is seen as somehow backward or an African barbarity is attributed to Spain is ascribed specifically to Andalusia. So there's that French adage, Africa begins at the Pyrenees. And there's a Spanish saying that defends against that, which is Andalusia es Africa. Andalusia is Africa. And within that, the Alpujarra region itself is seen as the most backward or barbaric or uncivilized area of Andalusia. And to give a taste of the Spanish texts that have participated in creating this image of the Alpujarra, we have one example from the 19th century that is a historical novel set in the 1400s that depicts the outlawed, exiled Muslims who sought refuge in the Alpujarra, with the word Monfi coming from the Arabic Manfi. And then there's also a very famous work by Pedro Antonio de Alarcón, who demonstrates a link to Spain's colonial project in North Africa because he served as a soldier and journalist in the Hispano-Moroccan War that initiated Spain's colonization of Morocco, and then afterwards went traveling through the Alpujarra to try and understand Spain's relationship to its Moorish past. And this travelogue is his account of that trip. This is a little taste of a British text on the region published in 1957 by the British author Gerald Brennan, who recounts his experiences living in a village in the Alpujarra in the 1920s. And it's full of references to the Moorish and Oriental ways of the townspeople, and also a very colonialist attitude in which he refers to it as my town repeatedly. As Monroe has demonstrated, a core issue in Spanish cultural history is how to assess medieval Muslim Iberia's cultural legacy. One of the key figures in the early 20th century manifestation of these debates was Américo Castro, as David mentioned earlier. Castro is famous for having developed the concept of convivencia, of living together, and focusing his interpretation on medieval Iberia on the scholarly and artistic synergy between Christians, Jews, and Muslims that took place there. Castro proposed that these three faiths enjoyed a Muslim-led tolerance that he dubbed La Convivencia. According to this interpretation, tolerance was one of several significant Muslim contributions to Spain's unique cultural history. The main opposing narrative of Al-Andalus from Castro's time posited that the authentic Spanish identity was Gothic, Germanic, and Roman in origin, that is, purely European, and that the period of Muslim and Jewish presence was a detriment to the development of Spain that must be overcome. Built upon Castro's narrative of harmonious...
Cristina,
Yes.
I think your slides aren't advancing. I don't know if you were meaning to advance in the PowerPoint.
I can.
Sorry.
It's okay.
It came up in it.
Okay, but thank you. Thanks for being on top of it. Built upon Castro's narrative of harmonious coexistence in Al-Andalus, the term convivencia has taken on a life of its own and is often used to refer to a utopian vision of interfaith harmony. The idea of the Spain of the three religions, anachronistic since it wasn't actually Spain yet, grew out of this and has become a catchphrase that is featured in a certain vein of Spanish historiography and in the promotion of tourism in Spain. The question of how much tolerance and of what sort there actually was in Al-Andalus has led to many scholarly studies. One conclusion of this research is that the systems of rule in place in Al-Andalus neither prevented certain kinds of discrimination and occasional religious violence, nor are analogous to modern political regimes. For these reasons, calls to reinstate the harmonies of convivencia in the present are problematic. However, in both the pre-modern and modern periods, one can find practices that are motivated by a desire to make room for diversity rather than eliminate it. Thus, while invocations of convivencia tend to ahistorically mythify interfaith harmony, they also reflect a persistent desire to find ways in which diversity and harmony can coexist. And for this reason, the convivencia is still invoked in contemporary narratives about the Alpujarra. So now I'm going to advance. And what I find particularly fascinating is that now the Alpujarra is still known as the source of jamón serrano, which obviously is a culinary remnant of the Inquisition, as a result of the desire to prove one's Christianness through pork and wine. But it is also known for being the home to Spain's largest community of European converts to Islam. And these are primarily Naqshbandi Sufis. So it is a location that is sought by Muslim tourists in Spain because they can get a lot of halal food, and this has been marketed as well using the history of Al-Andalus. So how did this come about? Well, first there was depopulation due to the Civil War, depopulation of that region, and then a large amount of locals emigrated elsewhere for work, primarily to Barcelona and Germany in the middle of the 20th century. There's also a phenomenon of return migration that I'm not going to get into here, but it plays a part in how the local Orgiveños relate to labor migration. And then starting in the 1980s, various hippies or alternatives arrived in the Alpujarra. So they set up communes, for instance, in abandoned hamlets. Other people with more means purchased farmhouses from families that had either left the region altogether for the reasons that I mentioned before, or who had decided to give up farming because they were barely making any money out of it. And out of that alternative community sprouted this interest in Sufism. And one of the members of the community ended up coming back to the area after converting to Islam and establishing this community of Sufis in the Alpujarra. The town of Otiva also is part of the broader phenomenon of Maghrebi migration to Europe. This includes a center for unaccompanied minor migrants. They arrive and start attending the local high school where they mix with all the other students. And an interesting remnant of this is a graffiti on the road to the center that I found a couple of summers ago that says Al-Ghurba Saiba in Moroccan dialect. And that theme of being a stranger is difficult, or being an exile is difficult, is one that's also threaded through the experience in the town. This migration pattern of Maghrebis in Europe is a flashpoint for tensions related to the concepts of civilization and ethno-nationalism that have been referred to by the speakers earlier today, and the idea that secularism and tolerance are European hallmarks that are somehow incompatible with Islam. In contrast with the Spanish historical fiction and histories in general, as well as anthropological studies, the English language accounts about the contemporary Alpujarra, or this New Age Alpujarra, emphasize diversity. So one major example is the series of memoirs by Chris Stewart, who has a very interesting personal history, but ended up becoming a farmer in the Ortiva area, and published 3 memoirs about his experiences that highlight both the migrant experience, that of returned migrants from the town, as well as Maghrebi migrants, and also the negotiation of authenticity and foodways. And his books are credited with having drawn even more Britons to the area, and they now make up about 20% of the population of the town. A newer book is by Medina Whiteman. It's a memoir, The Invisible Muslim, Journeys Through Whiteness and Islam, that presents her experience as someone of Anglo-American and British origins who was born into Islam through her convert parents and then settled in Ortiva. So it also emphasizes links to Al-Andalus, though it does so through the horticulture of the area, primarily the olive trees. But it also questions ethnicity-based constructions of identity and romanticizing impulses, and points to various forms of discrimination. In contrast with those works, there is a set of Spanish television shows that have dedicated full episodes or part of an episode to the town of Ortiva. And this arose once the town became known nationally and across Europe as a haven for alternative lifestyles. So these are new narratives in the sense that they are a new medium through television, but the underlying theme of convivencia as a simplified version of tolerance remains. So just to give an example of what I term convivencia washing, this is a little snippet from a television show focused on the town that references, it as the refuge of the last Nasser king, and that it presents part of the multicultural splendor of the past. It harbors in its streets more than 70 different nationalities. Perhaps the best known manifestation of this is the diverse blend is the Sufi community in the town, etc. So this one is very niche in the sense that, as you can guess from the name of the show, it's already targeting an audience that's interested in Islam. But another example is from a very popular television show, Radio Gaga. And in 2018, they had a whole episode focused on the town. And they bring their little camper van to the town and start transmitting radio from there, and have people supposedly spontaneously come to the mic, although it's all carefully prepped beforehand. What really struck me about this episode is that it has this emphasis on Ortiva as a space of spiritual renewal and on stories of the Sufi converts to Islam. And at one point, one of these converts comes in with a tray of Moroccan tea, and they do a toast in Arabic and everything, but they never mention the fact that there are also another group of Muslims. There's also another group of Muslims in the town who are the North African immigrants there. So I started carrying out interviews with these immigrants to see what their perspective was on the town. And one of the threads that came out was the idea that they felt at home there because there was such an awareness and respect for all things Muslim. So one of the people I interviewed, Malika, she made reference to that the fact that there was a lot of respect for what she was willing to eat and her, halal foods and an awareness of Ramadan. She also described it as being like one big family, El Kabira, and that she didn't feel like a stranger. So this was going back to the thread of estrangement and finding community in the town. Another interviewee, Mustafa, went into detail about clothing and said that where he used to live elsewhere in Andalusia, if he went out in his jalaba, he didn't feel comfortable, essentially. He felt that people gave him racist looks. But in contrast, in Ortiva, if he went out, people might even compliment his clothes. So in the course of the conversation with him, it became, we went into the topic of the Sufi converts, and he criticized them for being, not quite Muslim and not following the Sunnah or the Quran, from his perspective at least. But he also made it clear that he had no problems with them, that he was willing to tolerate them. And so it was, to me, an example of an exchange, where he realized that they created benefits by normalizing Middle Eastern dress and what, clothing that is associated by others with Islam. And so for that, he was willing to put up with their presence. So this demonstrates how even the most vulnerable participate in this exchange of tolerance. And I should pause here for a second to just briefly go into this concept of tolerance that has been critiqued by many scholars. For instance, Wendy Brown presents it as a process that serves to give a mantle of civilization to any group that can present themselves as tolerant. And as such, it's a tool of colonization and of other forms of domination. And many, many scholars have cited the problem of tolerance as something that basically consists of putting up with another. And this creates a negative effect on the feelings of self-worth of the person who is aware that they're being put up with. So in contrast, there are certain dynamics that create a sustainable tolerance, which is one that recognizes each participant's worth and each one's role in this exchange of toleration. Let's see. So to conclude now, given its deep associations with Al-Andalus and a pre-modern timelessness, the Alpujarra is simultaneously isolated and unique, and a concentrated version of Andalusia and Spain as frontier zones between north and south and east and west, between what are seen as modernity and primitiveness. Narratives of the region that are fixated on the Moorish past, or that build on that past to celebrate a superficial concept of convivencia, obscure the elements of the negotiation of tolerance in the area and its byproducts. And the elements of negotiation of tolerance that I found there are a feeling of estrangement that leads to reflection upon identity narratives, sustainable toleration dynamic that's built on mutual recognition, and tolerance as a multi-directional practice in which all participate. And its byproduct in this particular context is a shift in the definition of what is Muslim or Moro. Because you could tell in the town that there was a lot of fluidity in the way that these terms were used, where sometimes Moro could include someone who was a blonde, blue-eyed convert to Islam. And this links to this idea of the East-West identities being recalibrated. And this also is part of dismantling assumptions about civilizational discourses, because the townspeople and the other more recent newcomers actually view the Muslims in the town as being tolerant. So the conception of Europeans as having cornered the market on being civilized and tolerant is undone through the dynamic in the town. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristina. That was great. And we have now come to the end of the first panel. David, do you want to handle the Q&A? I know someone, Amina put a question in and Alejandro already answered it. So we can move to that. Can I also, David, just ask you quickly, because do you, and this is a logistical thing, and I'll let you and James think about it. Perhaps we could have James do his final remarks directly after Kevin and Dwight's panel, instead of having another break.
Yeah, that sounds like
Maybe you,
yeah.
maybe you can ask them and then let me know at the end of the Q&A, and
Yeah,
I can announce.
He's willing to do that, yeah.
Okay, can you handle the Q&A?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so let me just get my the proper windows open. If you are an if you are an attendee, you can ask your question in the Q&A function, which is open now, and I'll reread your question, and then we can have whoever, either one of the panelists can answer it from their microphone. Hold on one second. I'm losing my windows here. This isn't my machine. I'm confused. Hold on one second. I'm just trying to call up the, there we go. Okay, so if you have a question, please go to the Q&A function and type it in. Okay, question from Amina Boukail. I have a question for Cristina. Al-Bukharra was used in modern Arabic literature as a symbol of resistance. Al-Bukharra was used, okay. I want to know more about the revolution of Al-Bukharra, as it is called in Arabic studies, and its connection with the history of Algiers during the Ottoman period.
Well, I would love to be able to answer that question, but I'm not really sure in terms of the relationship to Algiers. I work more on 19th century into contemporary work, and how contemporary, 19th century plus writings and discourses portray the medieval period. I do know that there was an emigration, oddly enough, at the same time in the 19th century that people were leaving Spain for the Americas. A sizable number of people left for Algiers as a remnant of that connection. But unfortunately, I don't, it's an interesting question. I'd love to know, but I don't have the answer.
Thanks very much. I lost the window again. I'm not very good at this. Anyway, we have another question from Noel Morel. Question for anyone who wants to pick it up. How do you see the role of interdisciplinarity in forming your research? Many of us try to strike a balance between an attention to detail in texts and a form of historical rigor. But I'm wondering how, beyond literature, philology, and history, you see other disciplines such as anthropology, history of philosophy, etc., informing your respective intellectual projects, and of course, vis-a-vis that of Professor Monroe. Who wants to take that? Cristina, you have first refusal.
Sorry, it was breaking up. Can you repeat the last part?
Yeah. I'm wondering how beyond literature, philology, and history, you see other disciplines such as anthropology, history of philosophy, etc., informing your respective intellectual projects.
Yes, okay. Definitely, there's a lot of work, actually things that I did at Berkeley related to anthropology that have influenced this project in particular. And I think there's a nice dovetailing between the work that Professor Monroe initiated and then the work of people like Bridget Connolly, who I also took courses with, and who made me think critically about the methodologies involved in ethnographic research and informed the kind of field work that I was trying to do in this project. And I think that for me, the common thread is a focus on what are the narratives that have been created, whether it's in a written form or a televised form, or in the way that people speak about their community and their own life history. So it threading together how the scholarship about the medieval period has informed all these different layers of discourse is very illuminating.
Thanks very much for that explanation. And Brian or Alejandro, do you have any comments on how disciplines, especially perhaps social scientific disciplines, have influenced your own intellectual project?
I can jump into that. I would say it's crucial. I'm a big fan of interdisciplinarity, and one of the reasons is just in general is I think that we have to be careful of what you might refer to as the tyranny of rigor. By that, I don't mean we shouldn't be rigorous, but what I mean is that there's a certain school of historical writing that in the name of supposed rigor really grounds itself in this sort of notion that it's dangerous to extrapolate anything that can't be specifically read through the sources, right? And I think that's in theory it's wonderful, but I think that really in a way what it is, it's a recipe to guarantee that you're going to write bad history. And the reason I say that is because even in situations where we have a diverse body of sources, the sources that we have, particularly if we're talking about written sources as a historian, are so narrow, and they reflect such a narrow band of the historical reality of the societies that we're looking at, that if we take that evidence that was written down and survived and take that as sort of gospel and indicative of the larger historical reality, like I said, it's a guarantee to get things wrong. I always tell my students, I always say, imagine if 100 years from now, people were studying the history of the United States and all they had was Fox News, right? They would come up with a vision of the United States that was, rigorously derived from this source material they have. And it wouldn't be completely wrong, but it would be like very wrong kind of thing. And so we're in the same conundrum as historians. And the only way out of the trap is through interdisciplinary work, comparative work, and theoretical work, or applying theories and models to your work to be able to suggest what the sources do not give us and can never give us. And is it risky? Of course it is. But all history is an exercise in writing literature. It's always a reflection of our own priorities and biases. And so we just have to accept that as we move forward. And there was an article by, I think it was an article by Francesca Trivolato, in which she says, at the beginning of the article, she says something, she poses the question, you know, how can we, speaking about ethno-religious relations around the Mediterranean, she says, how can we reconcile, I'm quoting this from memory, so I might get it wrong, how can we reconcile the optimistic view of ethno-religious relations disclosed by material culture with the conflictive view of ethno-religious relations that we see in texts? And so, you know, there you go. This is the whole thing. Unless you have integrate a multiplicity of perspectives in your work, you're really setting out quite determinedly, kind of, I think, on the wrong path. As far as my own work goes, for me, a lot of sociological and anthropological perspectives have been enriching. I'm sure that if a sociologist read any of my stuff, they'd like split their sides laughing. But for me, it's been helpful. And, you know, frankly, I do the same thing when I read history that they write. So fair is fair. Anyways, that's my 2 bits on that.
Thanks very much. We have another question from Lily Farhoud for Professor Garcia-San Juan, but there's no text of the question. So Lily, would it be possible for you to write again in the chat the actual question? Here it is. The question is for Alejandro: de-Arabization versus Muslim compatibility. Can you speak more to this question?
I'm not sure I understand what Muslim compatibility means, really. I don't know if Lily can try to explain a little bit more about, because I'm not sure of understanding well.
About Frank, she adds.
Yeah, about Franco, but I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Can you maybe reformulate it in another way?
Moment, yeah. And can you, Alejandro, can you turn your volume down a bit there?
Sorry?
We're getting some feedback on the, no, it's good now. Okay, never mind. I'll go back to the queue to another question from Marcos Garcia. This is a question for Cristina Sivantos. It is related to the title of your great presentation, and it's about the foodways of the Muslim population in current-day Alpujarra. Just to be sure, do they follow Islamic food consumption patterns? Do they consider it important in the context of their Islamic identity?
Yes, the shortest version is yes. And thank you for that question, because the title is really trying to evoke that there is a constant negotiation regarding where, you know, what sort of practices are considered acceptable and what aren't. So there's, you know, a metaphorical use of haram and halal, but also there is a literal one in the sense that, for instance, I had conversations with some of the members of the European convert community, and one person particularly mentioned that when she was in England, you know, people were much more strict about, you know, her fellow Muslim converts were more strict about maintaining halal and, you know, not eating anything that was not slaughtered according to those rules, but that in Spain, she had found that the prevalence of pork was so strong that people were a little more, let's say, flexible. And as long as it wasn't pork, it was okay. So they would eat any other type of meat, whether it had been slaughtered in the halal fashion or not. As long as it wasn't pork, it was okay. So there's a constant negotiation of where the lines are drawn in terms of what is considered acceptable versus not. I also had a conversation with one of the young men who had been in the Center for Unaccompanied Migrants. And I remember that when I sat down and talked with him, we were at an outdoor cafe, and the waitress took his order and he asked for a beer, but immediately told her he didn't want a tapa, like the free little snack that's brought with the food. And I was puzzled by that. And then sure enough, eventually the conversation took us back there. And he explained that he had been told by a friend that sometimes the food would, whatever the tapa was, could come into contact with pork. So he had decided to never have tapas at restaurants again, and only order certain items that he could be more sure of. So there's, an ongoing concern about how to meld these different practices. And add to that the fact that there's a whole, series of interests in alternative diets in terms of, macrobiotic, vegan, etc. So there's a whole confluence of different food cultures coming together there in interesting ways.
Thanks very much for elaborating on that. I have another question from Gema Perez Sanchez, also for Cristina Sivantos. Could you say more about the relationship between Orgiva and the Spanish government? In other words, has the central government paid any attention to Orgiva as a model for a future religiously and ethnically pluralist Spain?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I don't think that the central government in terms, has taken note. However, the Andalusian government has. So I think it was in 2009 or thereabouts, there was a project of the Junta de Andalucía to bring a group, a team of people to do oral histories and basically create awareness of community relations under the umbrella of the idea of a sustainable community, sustainable both in ecological as well as community well-being. And so they went to various different towns to try and find who their candidate was for this project. And one of the towns that was considered was Orgiva. And because of the enthusiasm of the townspeople and the local mayor at the time, it was chosen for the project. And a book was published with all of these materials. And I have a section of my book on that. It's very interesting because they did not, within that catalog of local statements about the town, they never identify who the speaker is. So there's sort of a loss there in terms of understanding the dynamics. But it's definitely trotted out by the Junta de Andalucía as this example of tolerance and multiculturalism, but again, without getting into the details of what that involves.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that explanation. We now do have a question from Amina Bukail, who sent this to Alejandro. Is the echo of colonialism, and this is a question for Alejandro, is the echo of colonialism, colonial ideology still present among Spanish scholarship now in the study of the Arab history of Spain?
Okay, thank you. Well, as I've tried to show in my presentation, I think we need to distinguish between Muslim Spain and Reconquista. Both are, to my mind, colonialist and nationalist notions, but Muslim Spain at present, I think, is very much an outdone concept in scholarship. However, with regard to Reconquista, the situation is a bit different because there is a rising up in Spain of the Reconquista narrative, which goes very much in tandem with obviously social and political tendencies, and that are likewise on the rise in Spain. So with regard to the notion of Reconquista, we can say yes, there is still some sort of colonialist narrative still going on in some sectors of Spanish scholarship. Yes, perhaps a minority, but significant, I think.
Thank you very much for your answer. Let's see. We have another question. This one's for Brian Catlos. There are many administrative, and this is from Gema Perez Sanchez, I should mention. There are many administrative and disciplinary difficulties of moving toward a model of Mediterranean studies within US academia, considering that departments are still organized in fairly traditional units. How do you propose that we start thinking of such reorganization in a practical, and I'm here reading a practical administrative way?
Okay, great question. Except, I'm not sure that really it's, let me just find the question again. It's disappeared. So I can refer to it. I'm really not so sure that it's much more difficult here than it is in other places. For example, I suspect that it might be actually more difficult in many European institutions, which might be less institutionally nimble than universities in the US. But I would say a couple of things. One is, I don't have any problem with this, with disciplinarity and with departments organized around disciplines. I think it's really important, right? So I think the way to sort of integrate interdisciplinary perspectives in an institutional way, there's a couple ways. One is through the establishment of centers that bridge departments, obviously, and quite frankly, if you want to do something like that, it doesn't take a lot of money or resources. All it takes simply is the willing collaboration of your colleagues to organize a colloquium or something like that. This is how we started the Mediterranean Seminar, and now we have something like 2,000 members. So just do it, I think, is one sort of answer. The other thing is, I think that with the upside, if you can call it that, of our terrible economic situation in terms of humanities in particular, is that probably institutions are more interested now in hiring scholars that can cover more than one field or region or area, and I think that kind of plays into our hands, and I think you see a lot of that. So I think that is a promising sign. But I think really what's going to drive this is the fact that graduate students now are increasingly trained to be interdisciplinary and comparative. So the people that are now peopling those departments and are, if not now, will soon be running them, have, I think, a completely different perspective on these things that are gonna be much more, speaking in a generalization, probably much more amenable to such approaches, and they will feel less defensive about their disciplines, and they won't feel like the mere suggestion of interdisciplinarity is an assault on their intellectual fiefdom or something like that. So as I said, I'm quite positive about it, and I think the main thing is to start doing this kind of work and organizing your colleagues to collaborate, and then it's going to happen. And I think if these institutional changes happen, the best changes are those that are driven from the bottom, not mandated from the top, like this, the endless series of mandates we have for interdisciplinarianism that are cooked up by administrators or even scholars that have no clue what interdisciplinarity is. So.
Excellent point. Thanks for that answer. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other? We don't seem to have any other Qs in the queue and AQ. So this might be a good time to wrap up the Q&A and move to hear Professor Monroe's comments. And Michelle, how are we doing on time?
We're fine. I think we can take a break for lunch, right? And then we have the second panel at 1:30 your time.
Yeah. And but you were suggesting that we move Professor Monroe's comments to which slot?
The end of that second panel.
Into the second panel. Okay, great. So that's what we can do then. So I'd like to please join me in thanking our participants and the panelists and everybody who asked questions, excellent questions. Thank you very much. And we will pause the recording now.
Professor Monroe's evaluation. Oh, sorry. Okay, this is being recorded. That's fine. Of the sort of discretion and careful evaluations, the equanimity with which he has evaluated different scholars with whom he may or may not have agreed, but offered to the rest of us, sort of a guidebook through a century or a century and a half of Spanish scholarship. But the third observation I had was actually very pertinent to this presentation, because I began to think, thinking again about how Ribera and Tarragó and Menendez Pidal and others really dealt with music. And of course, Professor Monroe has as well. And I thought to myself, this is actually unique to Spanish scholarship, because I don't think that any other national school of medieval Iberian scholarship or scholarship in Al-Andalus held music as such a central cultural aspect of what was going on in the Middle Ages. The great scholar of medieval Arab music, Henry George Farmer, was very much focused on the Eastern Mediterranean. He did publish a couple of things, one collection of texts called an Old Moorish Lute Tutor, but he really didn't deal with Al-Andalus at all, and very few other people did. So I sort of offer thanks to those Spanish scholars and to James Monroe himself for, pulling music back into the discussion of cultural history in Al-Andalus. So, and I ask, can you see my PowerPoint? Can somebody respond? I cannot see you.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
No.
Hold on just a sec. Okay. Let's see. Then we'll try the. Whoops. We tested it, and
Yeah.
let's see. How about that?
Well, it says screen. Yeah.
All right. Okay. There we go. From the beginning then. Okay. So 50 years of Islam and the Arabs in Spanish scholarship. I gave subtitled it a tribute to James T. Monroe. And I came up with the not so very innovative topic of 50 plus years of scholarship on music in medieval Iberia. And I'll start out by just sort of offering this list of selected publications. These are works that all of you know, but it's just so impressive to me, the number of works that Professor Monroe contributed to our understanding of Muashi, of the Zajjal, and musical aspects of this. He was and continues to be a real champion of the musical dimension of these traditions. And so, in that sense, I'm, very happy to consider myself a student who has followed in his footsteps in appreciating the musical dimensions of these traditions. To summarize the last 50 years of scholarship on medieval Iberian music, or particularly music in Al-Andalus, I thought I would divide things up into three different categories. One is new texts that have surfaced in recent decades, a couple of examples of reevaluations of known texts, and then also a couple of examples of new archival research. One of the things that I always present to my students, and oftentimes to public audiences when I lecture, is that those of us who deal with the medieval Arabic tradition are like sailors in a small boat on a large ocean, a broad ocean, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts that are still out there that have never received attention from modern scholars, Arab or Western. So we can never tell what's going to pop up, and things pop up constantly. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of the things that are most interesting in terms of the study of medieval Andalusian music that have emerged, come to light in recent years. the text by Ahmed Tifashi, we had the two small chapters on Andalusian music that first came to light for most of us in 1968 with the Arabic edition that was published by Atanji, but came to the attention of the rest of the world in Professor Monroe's and Benjamin Liu's 10 Hispano-Arabic strophic songs in the modern oral tradition, where a translation of these two small sections appeared. And it was certainly something that I found extraordinarily exciting when I first read that book. But astonishingly, the full Arabic text, the much larger Arabic text, Mut'at al-Asma' fi ilm al-Sama', the ear's pleasure in music's measure, if you will excuse the rhyme there, and only came to light, it has only been published 3 years ago. Now, I have to say that most of that book is not specifically about Andalusian music. So it is about music in general, but it's a very rich and wonderful text. But there are passages that refer to Al-Andalus, and I've chosen one that I thought was actually, for me at least, the most interesting reference to Al-Andalus. And that is that Al-Tifashi has a wonderful little section on dance. And there are really very few medieval Arabic works that deal specifically with dance. He first divides dance into two types. The first is dancing performed by humans with the whole body. And then the second is when images or figurines are made to dance, tarqis, that is what we would call a form of puppetry. And so he divides each of these two categories into 4 types. Dancing with the whole body is further divided into plain dancing, in which the dancer uses no props, dancing mounted on play wooden horses, kuraj, we've known about this from Ibn Khaldun and other sources, dancing with swords, with balls, with glass bottles, with ropes or castanets made of black wood, shiza, and dancing by stamping the feet. So for all of those people who are trying to draw a line between flamenco and medieval Arab music, this is going to, I think, ignite a whole new set of speculations. But when he gets to discussing the puppetry, he says the first form is by puppeteers hidden behind a curtain with ornate puppets fashioned to imitate all manner of people dressed in their appropriate costumes. They are made to dance to the accompaniment of music and singing. So this is actually spectacular. We do not know of marionettes, that is the type of puppetry we refer to in English as marionettes, being performed in the Eastern Mediterranean. We have shadow puppetry, where something similar might be done. And of course, you might know that there are several articles about puppetry and marionettes in medieval Spain in the Christian kingdoms. I believe this is the first reference that we have to this type of performance, to the accompaniment of music and singing in Al-Andalus proper. And of course, he even says, he gives us a description, and he says the puppets are manipulated by hairs which are invisible to the spectators, and this art is highly appreciated in Al-Andalus and the Maghrib. All right? But he complains he has found no verses of poetry or passages in prose that describe or praise this art form. I should say that all the other things that he lists, he always gives a few examples, verses of poetry that are about this type of dance. So a fascinating, I don't know of any other source, and I'm not sure how one could research that further, but a fascinating reference to a type of what might have been a more popular form of entertainment, not just in the court. Another text which has completely reshaped our understanding of medieval music in Al-Andalus is that what is called the second book, As-Sifr al-Thani of Ibn Hayyan's Kitab al-Muqtabis, the quoter, has come to light. And this includes the 11th century, Ibn Hayyan is from the 11th century, the biography, the much fuller biography of the legendary musician Ziryab, which he compiled from multiple and at times contradictory sources, using the typical approach of medieval Islamic scholarship. When he had conflicting accounts of some aspect, he put them right next to each other, leaving the reader to decide which of them was more reliable. So this text found and it came to light was first published in 1999 in facsimile, then a Spanish translation in 2001, and then finally an Arabic translation edition in 2003. The version of Ziryab that we have that is equally famous in the Middle East and in the West comes to us through a 17th century author known to many people who study medieval Iberia, al-Maqri, who was originally from Tlemcen, Algeria, and wrote in Cairo. So he was writing for an Eastern authorship, trying to explain to them what Al-Andalus was about, if you will. And it's his version of Ziryab that has become so well known. But now we can compare his version with the text that was his source text. We know it was his source text because most of his text is verbatim copied from Ibn Hayyan. This is not a rephrasing, this is a copying out almost verbatim. But over and over again, we find that he trimmed just a little bit and suppressed a little bit there and bowdlerized the text a little bit here, and thereby created the mythic figure of Ziryab that is known today. I'm going to give you one example. It's my favorite little example. Every text that deals with Ziryab oftentimes quotes the anecdote that when he arrived in Cordoba, supposedly from Baghdad, his haircut was so elegant that the nobles of the Arab court all cut their hair to look like Ziryab. That's something a little bit odd about nobles cutting their hair to look like a musician. So here is al-Maqri's text. When Ziryab arrived in Al-Andalus, all who lived there, men and women, used to dress the hair of their head by combing it parted in the middle of the forehead, hanging loose over their temples and eyebrows. But when the people of refinement, among them saw the coiffure worn by Ziryab, his sons and his womenfolk, cut over the forehead, straight across the eyebrows, tucked behind the ears, but flowing at the temple, as is worn today by eunuch servants and singing girls, al-Maqri just says their hearts embraced it and they approved of it, giving rise to the myth that they all cut their hair to look like Ziryab. So if we look at Ibn Hayyan, we find the exact passage verbatim, except that it says, tucked behind the ears, flowing at the temple, as is worn today by eunuchs and servants and the finest singing girls. They, the nobles, adopted it for their slaves, and they found it fitting for their male and female servants and switched them to this style and had them wear it. Their coiffure, that of slaves, servants, singing girls, and eunuchs, has continued to be in this style. By eliminating that one passage, al-Maqri gave birth to a myth about the court of Cordoba all cutting their hair to look like Ziryab. He does this repeatedly over and over and over. And now that we have the original text, we can, as I and others have begun to do, try to reevaluate the story of Ziryab, what is history and what is myth. Another major addition to our understanding of the Muashi tradition, the musical tradition behind it, is a songbook that predates the Kunash of al-Ha'ik. So Moroccan Muashi poetry and song is basically, found in one primary source, which is called the Kunash of a man named al-Ha'ik. And everybody refers back to this as the prime source, the origin point of the Moroccan tradition. But in 1995, a Moroccan scholar published an earlier songbook, probably about 80 years earlier, and it's not a complete manuscript, so it overlaps with the Kunash of al-Ha'ik, and there are 168 songs organized in 6 suites, but of these, only 50%, 84 of these do not appear in al-Ha'ik, and 84 do. So we are stuck with 2 songbooks, one that has always been considered essentially the be-all and end-all of the Moroccan tradition, and now we have an earlier songbook that only has a 50% overlap in repertory. So we're stuck wondering, is this the result of the intervening decades, right? And if the repertory could change so dramatically in 80 to 90 years, that would mean that the Muashi tradition was evolving rapidly in the 17th and 18th centuries, rather than being, as it is now, rather calcified and frozen. Another possibility is that these 2 songbooks represent 2 regional traditions, North and South, or each collection could in fact represent the author or the compiler's personal selection from a much broader repertory that we may never know about. But in any case, the idea that Kunash al-Ha'ek, the later songbook, represents the beginning and the sort of major source of the Moroccan tradition has been completely shattered, and we now all have to reevaluate that claim. A third example is a text, it's an encyclopedic text from 14th century Syria. You might think, what in the world could we find in 14th century Syria that would help us about music in Al-Andalus? This is Ibn Fadallah Umri's Masalik al-Absar fi Mamalik al-Ansar, the paths of perception in the realms of the great cities. And volume 10 is exclusively about music. It's almost 500 pages long, an enormous collection of things about music, mostly about the Eastern Mediterranean. And at the very, very end, which seems to have missed, people have not seemed to have noticed, is that there are 18 biographies of singers from Al-Andalus. Much more information about singers in Al-Andalus than we have ever had before. There are 3 extant manuscripts, and there are 3 Arabic editions, 2003, 2005, 2010. And I can tell you, since I've been trying to work on this text in the recent years, the 3 manuscripts and the 3 Arabic editions, the Arabic editions, none are based on all 3 extant manuscripts. And whenever you get to a difficult passage, there are as many as 6 different readings according to the 3 different scribes and the 3 different Arabic editors. So it's really a mess, I think is the technical term, but I'm trying to put some logic and a little bit of work into trying to figure out what these texts mean. Another thing, of course, and I'll just give a couple of examples, are reevaluations of texts that we have already known, that have already been published in Arabic and have been translated, the most famous of which is Dar al-Tiraz fi Amal al-Murshahat by Ibn Sina al-Mulk. This is the single most important medieval Arabic treatise on the Muashi. And I'll plug my most recent book that Michelle was kind enough to mention. A full English translation of this text is found in the Medieval Arab Music and Musicians. This, of course, was translated by Emilio Garcia Gomez, but strangely, and no one's ever explained to me quite why, maybe Professor Monroe can enlighten me on this, he seems to have had a peculiar resistance to anything having to do with music. And I've given you various different quotes. It is just extraordinary that as he translates this text, he doubts whether the relationship between the music and the lyrics even existed at all. Sometimes he seems to accept that music played some role in the Muashi tradition, but he considers Ibn Sina al-Mulk claim to be exaggerated, and he repeats the same claim over and over again. 4 different times he says the author is exaggerating. He complains of the author's ignorance and his incompetence, his ignorancia and incapacidad. But at the same time, he also confesses that he himself does not understand some of the key passages. So in giving this a new translation into English, what I've tried to do is, of course, first make it accessible to people for whom the Arabic and the Spanish texts are not easily understood, but also to give a translation that offers the author, Ibn Sina al-Mulk, a little more respect. I've tried to produce his ideas as clearly as possible. People can accept them or reject them, but certainly not to present them as the sort of the writings of an incompetent author. So with full respect to Ibn Sina al-Mulk, I offer a new translation of Dar al-Tiraz. Here's an interesting example. Rather than a text, this is, of course, the most famous image, for those of us who study Al-Andalus, the most famous image from the Cantigas de Santa Maria. And of course, we have for decades and decades, based on a passage by Menendez Pidal, that this is a Christian minstrel and a Moorish minstrel who are singing together, and people have made all sorts of interesting interpretations of the image. Let me first give you Menendez Pidal's, say this image presents before our eyes the figures of a Moorish minstrel and a Christian one singing a duet, a duo, or together, both standing next to a small table where the wine that inspires them is found. I have no idea how he knew that that was a jug of wine and not a jug of water, but that's not my main problem with this interpretation. Look at this image again. So Menendez Pidal says that this is a Christian minstrel. Does it not strike you as strange, almost impossible, that this minstrel is wearing a sword? in what type of world do we have minstrels walking into court wearing a sword? Right? Would this even be allowed? So I wonder, I scratch my head and wonder whether the image of the sword there is not actually meant to give us more of a social message, a question of class, that this Christian, clearly a Christian who is singing, and I should note this is the only image of someone singing. All of the other images of musicians are playing musical instruments. So here we have a Christian singing, and I wonder if we're supposed to see that sword as a mark of class, that this is someone from the elite, a nobleman, and that is, should we understand this? I leave this completely open. It suggests to me the possibility that we should understand that it is an upper class person who is civilized enough, educated enough, erudite enough to be singing or performing with a Moorish musician. Just a possibility. I will point out one other thing though, and that is that I have heard and read several different times where people say, the fact that the Moor is barefoot and that the Christian is shod is an sort of image of the sort of the submissive role of the Moor in a Christian court. And I have to say, this does not ring true to me at all. I think this is probably nothing more than a portrayal of an actual daily domestic practice where Moors would have removed their sandals or shoes when going to an interior space, and Christians did not. And we can look at El Libro de Ajedrez, the book of chess and games, also done at the same time during the reign of Alfonso el Sabio, and we can see that now we have the complete reverse situation. It is now the Moor, right, who is wearing a sword because he is now entertaining a Christian emissary in his tent. And we find he is barefoot. There's on a rug, you can see there's some, and the Christian, I don't know whether, he has removed shoes or whether he is just, this is what he's wearing. When I presented this at one point, a friend told me, I said, it may just be that it's easier to kick off your sandals than it is to remove your hose. And so I wonder about this interpretation that this image represents somehow something that we should understand to be the status of the Moor in a Christian court. The final thing I wanted to point out is that there have been several scholars who have done wonderful work in archival research, and I'm so grateful that they have done so. Probably the most important is Maria del Carmen Gomez Montaner and her study of music in the royal house of Catalan Aragon. And she has gone through and picked out every detail in the financial records for 150 years, well, almost, so 100 years or so, and picked out every detail about music, buying musical instruments, getting musical instruments repaired, minstrels being paid, how much they were paid, et cetera, et cetera. It's really an extraordinary thing. And among all of that is quite an interesting series of little texts that have to do with payments made to Moorish minstrels, Muslim and Jewish musicians who are being brought up from the south, from Valencia. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Here we have the Fulani, and some texts that we call the Fulani family, which is closer to the Arabic, and in this they're called the Al-Fulai. They performed for several different kings of Catalonia Aragon. In June 12th, 1389, King Juan I wrote to Valencia asking that the wife of Al-Fulay, his mother, and the most talented female Moorish joglaresses of Valencia be sent to his court as soon as they received his letter, and that they should bring their musical instruments and their jokes, literally their games, but probably whatever equipment they used in their performances. This, we might think back to a Tafeshi's description of different types of dance. And so this already seems, although this is the earliest document, it already seems that the court is familiar with this family. right? Because we have this little notation that he's literally saying, bring the wife of Al-Fulay. And so it seems that they were appearing before this. On the September 9th of that same year, he ordered that they be paid a reasonable amount so that they could return to their homes with his permission, in a letter that mentions several of their names, some of which we can, sort of resuscitate the Arabic. So Mas'ud, Shamari Maryam, and his mother and the other Moorish Khugars. And then some 24 years later, in 1413, King Fernando wrote from Lerida asking that the same minstrels, or perhaps their descendants, along with their wives, they're always invited with their women folk, los Khudgar Moros Al-Fulays Abses Muhayyar, be sent to him at Zaragoza for an event to take place on January 12th, noting in passing that they also used to entertain his uncle, King Martin. In addition, he ordered that they be clothed in livery, all of one color. And I'll just put a brief footnote. This is a tradition that began in the court of Burgundy, in the court of Bourgogne, where they began to cause all of their court musicians to be dressed in livery and given in court colors, etc. And it rapidly spread throughout Europe. And here we can see that it has arrived in Catalonia and Aragon. One other wonderful work of archival research, and I'm sorry that he hasn't done more with this, is Eliezer Gutwert's work on the Inquisition and musical aspects of identity and in 15th century Spain. Just to give you two examples. In Inquisition records from Sigüenza from 1492 to 1504, we have confessions of some 18 Christians, 16 women and 2 men of having danced at Jewish weddings. And then from Saragossa, we get a much more detailed account. We get the account names of Christian musicians who performed at Jewish and Muslim weddings. Francisco performed at both Jewish and Muslim weddings. Juan de Saragossa played flute at a Jewish wedding in the village of Pino, and Triboulet served as a tamborino at a Jewish wedding. But it also goes the other direction. Amazingly enough, there are also records of Jews hiring Christian and Muslim musicians to perform at their events. Here we have an account of hiring Christian musicians, including 2 of the aforementioned musicians, to perform for the arrival of a new Torah at the local synagogue. So immediately begin asking ourselves, do we have a glimpse here? Do musicians from these different religious communities learn, or were they at least familiar with, the repertories of their neighboring groups? Or, which I think more likely, were musical and dance traditions for festival occasions at the local level, at the village level, shared, while music of a more religious level was distinct? Nothing but a glimmer of what might have been happening below the level of the courts and the royal traditions. 3 other happening in with different scholars, and that is trying to get a I see my internet is unstable. I'm hoping that you can still hear me. Trying to examine a broader musical culture of medieval Iberia rather than just the narrow focus on the Muashi and the Zajal. Also, the examination of the role of Mudéjar, Morisco, and Sephardi Converso musicians. Remember, not everybody left in 1492, and ongoing work on North African Jewish traditions. In particular, I said the spectacular work of Edwin Sarusi and others who are bringing that material to our eyes. With that, I'd just like to say thank you, as we say in Arabic, shukran li husni istima'akum. I thank you for the goodness of your listening.
Hey, thank you so much, Dwight. All right, our next speaker is Kevin Blankenship, and does he want to try his computer, Dave? You know?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's going to be awkward because I'm speaking and I can also hear myself speaking. So there's a bit of an echo.
Echo.
Yeah, how do we want to do this? Okay. So can you guys
Is there
still hear
another
me on Zoom?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So yeah. Excellent. And then let me share my screen very quickly before I launch into my piece.
And I can introduce you as well.
Michelle's trying to say something.
What is it, Michelle?
Wait, did you want to say something again, Michelle?
Well, I was going to introduce you, but if it's going to complicate.
Oh, no, sorry. I forgot that part. Go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. I'll talk and then I'll let you work out. So I'm thrilled to introduce Kevin Blankenship, and I'm really sorry I'm not there in person because you were like, is anyone going to be there? And I was like, I am going to be there. I'm so excited. And then I couldn't make it. So, but it's a delight to see you virtually. Kevin Blankenship is assistant professor of Arabic at Brigham Young University. He completed his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2018 and has published on the work of Al-Ma'ari and Arabic criminal slang. He is committed also to the public humanities. He reviews books for general interest audiences, writes commentary about Middle Eastern culture and society, and works as a freelance Arabic translator. And you can read his work in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Jadaliya, and Bridges Magazine. And that's a very brief introduction, and I'll pass it.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thanks to everyone for inviting me to come. I feel in some ways a bit of an outsider because I didn't have the pleasure of studying with Professor Monroe, but feel very much like I have a relationship with him through his work, and now finally get a chance to meet him and interact with all of you in such a wonderful setting to honor his legacy. And so thank you for coming and listening. To my presentation, let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see what I am seeing? Okay. And then I want to make sure that it moves forward. That's working? Okay, great. I don't want to give the game away, but just to make sure that the slides are working. So my topic is a Benu Sasan underworld poem by Nasrid Andalusi jurist Omar al-Maliki. And, I'll share this quote from The Mischievous Muse, one of Professor Monroe's many works, because it speaks to sort of the theme that runs throughout his work that I'll be addressing as I present sort of a case study that I'm working through and sort of through example, like talk about the influence that Professor Monroe's work has had on me and other Arabists of my generation. So again, this quote is from the introduction to The Mischievous Muse, talking about Ibn Quzman, and says, by encouraging us to laugh at his absurd antics, he, meaning the poet of Ibn Quzman's verse, causes us to reject his superficial values as false, thereby instructing us by amusing rather than by preaching to us. And I'll be talking about a different figure in the world of classical Arabic literature, but I think this quote speaks to sort of the theme, the general theme that this figure, Omar al-Zajjal, sort of falls into, and talking about Professor Monroe's long engagement with tricksters, with maqamat, picaresque stories, and other things like that. I think speaks to the spirit of the work. Anyway, so my talk will break down into two sort of basic parts. The first is to introduce this person, Omar al-Zajjal, or Omar al-Maliki, as he's known in pre-modern sources. And then the second part will be to dive into this very interesting poem, this Qasida Sasaniya that he wrote. So the man that we're talking about, his full name is Abu Ali Umar ibn Umar al-Hajj al-Sa'idi al-Maliki, or simply Omar al-Zajjal, Omar the Zajjal poet, or al-Maliki, so the man from Malaga. And al-Maqari, who already came up in Professor Reynolds' talk, said that in his day, Omar was more illustrious than a light on a guidepost, ashhar min nar al-alam, and also a cavalier of Qasida poetry, min fursan hadha al-majal. And then a modern author, Yako Hamin Antila, said, Umar is the last documented Andalusian maqama author writing in Arabic. And it raises this question, and we're not going to be talking about his maqama that survives, but just to point out the fact that he was apparently the last maqama author that we know writing in Arabic in Al-Andalus. But this raises a question. If he was so popular, why has he remained hidden since then? It's an important question since we lack edited Arabic texts, documentary evidence. The manuscripts are there, but they're not edited yet in Arabic for Umar's time. This would be the last, 3/4 of a century of Nasrid rule in Granada. And moreover, since he was the last Arabic maqama author in Al-Andalus, that makes him important for Arabic literary history. So I think it's important to delve into his life and works. Conveniently, I have a slide about that. So according to L.P. Harvey, writing about the 15th century of Nasrid rule, or of the 15th century in which the Nasrids were ruling at Granada, bloodshed and violence in the palace was reflected in bloodshed and violence on the frontiers, meaning that there were both internal struggles and outside incursions onto the realm. So in the way of internal struggles, in 1417, there was a coup by the Banu Sarraj family, or Aben Serrajes in Castilian, and they installed a new monarch. This is Muhammad IX al-Aysar, or the left-handed, Zurdo, in Castilian in 1419. And this Muhammad was, over the next 4 decades, exiled and reinstated no fewer than 4 times. So obviously this didn't make for a very stable environment. And then in terms of outside incursions, in 410, the ruler of Castile, Fernando, launched a successful campaign on Antequera. And then in 1432, between the next 2 decades, there were sort of minor skirmishes, but then this battle of Higuerera, the little fig tree battle, sort of sparked more warfare, which continued up through the 1440s. And that's when we find this figure, Omar. We really don't know that much about his life individually, but what Al-Maqbari tells us is that he was a jurist, a faqih from Malaga, who wrote in this period of the end of the first half of the 15th century, just half a century before the Christian conquest of Granada. And that he was known for zajals, qasidas, and maqamat. And then to turn to his works, there's at least one surviving zajal that's been edited by Muhammad bin Sharifa in his book about popular sayings, maxims, and also zajal poems. And then he has this maqama fi amr al-waba, the maqama on the calamity of the plague. And the speaker in this maqama is the city of Malaga itself. Then that's the poet's hometown. And this city personified pleads with a personified Alhambra at Granada to let the Nasrid court move from Granada to Malaga to avoid the outbreak of plague. And this maqama was translated to Spanish by Fernando de la Granja in the cited work there. A third work by Umar al-Maliki that survives is called Farrajat al-Kurab fi Madh Sayyid al-Ajam wal-Arab, also known as al-Qasida al-Walhaniya, the astonished ode or the ode of astonishment. And this is a praise poem to the Prophet Muhammad. It's 230 lines, so relatively long. And then this strange 83-line poem that I'll be talking about today, called Tasrih al-Nisal ila Maqatil al-Fassal, a salvo of arrows targeting the false praisers' vitals. An intriguing title in itself. But before we go further, I want to bring a quote or put up a quote by Professor Hamin Antila, again, speculating about the transmission of Umar's works and why they may or may not have come down to us. And this partly goes to the question I asked at the beginning, which is, if this guy was so famous in his time, why don't we know him better now? Umar al-Maliki is reported to have been popular among the ordinary people, Amma, but this may be misleading, as Amma does not necessarily mean the common people, as it is often mistranslated, but simply the less civilized among the literati. So in a footnote, he gives the example of Lahan al-Amma, which apparently refers not to grammatical mistakes among commoners, but grammatical mistakes made by literati who are less educated or civilized, perhaps. Thus, one can only speculate on the popularity of these stories and whether they could have survived the end of Islamic rule as an oral tradition until the mid-16th century, meaning how much they actually move among common people, among the populace, as opposed to elite circles. So that takes us through the first part of my talk, a brief introduction to this Umar, and now to talk more about this Qasida poem We have two sources for it, and they're both by a man already mentioned by, again, Professor Reynolds. This is Shihabuddin al-Maqari. By these two anthologies that are very important for our understanding of how people sort of back projected onto Al-Andalus, what they thought that culture and that tradition in that time meant, Naf' al-Tib and Azhar al-Riyad. So this poem is preserved in both of these. And in, I believe it's the Azhar al-Riyad, there's a couple of lines that appear that don't appear in the other one. So al-Maqari Baudelairized one version of the poem and then kept these lines in it in the other one. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this goes, I mean, it's great that Professor Reynolds brought this up in terms of al-Maqari's penchant for trimming and modifying and things to suit his purposes. This is another example of him doing that. So this salvo of arrows targeting the false praiser's vitals invokes the name Sasan, and by doing so, Omar situates his tasrih, this poem, within a small but easily recognizable, relatively small but easily recognizable group of poems and maqamat about the Banu Sasan, who are traditionally understood to be an itinerant society of dervishes, entertainers, beggar thieves, quack doctors. There's all kinds of various figures, and again. The next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how we need to, it's maybe a bit more complicated than some scholars have traditionally thought, including myself. But these maqamat, just to give a few examples from belletristic literature that treats this, this society of itinerants. The maqamat compilations of Badi' al-Zaman and al-Hariri each have a maqama Sasaniya. And these are, again, picaresque tales. The maqama of al-Hariri in particular involves an elder sheikh of the Banu Sasan. He's in charge and he's sort of passing the torch to his young protege and who is his son. There's poems on the Banu Sasan by Abu Dulaf al-Khazraji, which vaunts the whole society of Banu Sasan in general, by Abu al-Qasim al-Wasani, in which the speaker falls victim to boorish freeloaders. They sort of come into his house and sponge off of him. And then Safi ad-Din al-Halli, who lived in the Mamluk era. Other sources include one of the surviving shadow plays by Ibn Daniel, Ajib wa Gharib, the Book of Misers, al-Bukhala by al-Jahiz, and then a source that I really thought important to mention. This is Ibrahim al-Ma'mar, a Mamluk era vernacular poet who's explicitly identified as a Gharib. I'll address this point in a minute, because the Banu Sasan by Ibrahim al-Ma'mar's time identified as ghuraba, strangers, itinerants, people who don't claim a specific geographical location or even ethnicity, but rather one of their defining features as a community is the fact that they're on the move and don't settle. And he lived in the Gharib quarter of medieval Cairo and integrated scene terminology into his work. What is scene? Cristina Richardson just put out a wonderful book called Roma in the Medieval Islamic World, and it really challenges some long-standing assumptions about the Banu Sasan. I wanted to point it out, not because we're focusing on anthropology or linguistic anthropology even in my talk, but because it sheds light on sort of the people, the society that this one particular poet was channeling in this poem, and helps us understand it a little bit better. So some of the takeaways in Professor Richardson's book include that the language of the Banu Sasan is a living language. This blew my mind, because medievalists typically think of this as as I'll say in the next takeaway point, as a sort of fossilized, beggar's cant or jargon that's, this historical curio preserved in text, but which isn't around today anymore. It is in fact survived. It's called seen or sometimes seam. In Northern Africa, for example, some Ghaus dialects have vocabulary from this language. In Central Asia, the dialect of Abdel Dili incorporates some seen words. And speaking of the seen language, it's often been mischaracterized as a secret language or thieves' cant. It is in fact a mixed language, according to Professor Richardson, that takes the form of embedding vocab into the grammatical structure of another language. So this is like Yiddish, which has a German grammatical base interspersed with Hebrew vocabulary. And more generally, instead of identifying the Banu Sasan as the shadowy brotherhood of the medieval underworld, which it's often taken to be, and again, myself included, It should be understood as a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional group that consciously styled itself as a tribal nation with an eponymous founder. This is Sasan, from whom the tribe takes its name. Sub-tribes organized by profession, local sheikhs, and a mixed language called Sin. And then by the late 13th century, the term Ghuraba, or strangers, which I mentioned before, had become synonymous with the Banu Sasan. So just a few points there to sort of enrich this this character Sasan, and then this underworld society, or this tribal society that Omar Az-Zajjal talks about. Now turning to the Qasida in particular, I'm going to summarize different sections of the Qasida that sort of go together, and then just put up one or two lines from those sections. It's a long poem, it's 83 lines, and in the interest of time, I didn't want to put up all 83. The first lines call for readers to renew the Sasanian path or order, and to pledge loyalty to Sheikh Sasan against those who dissemble and slander. And he says, "Come, let's reclaim the path of Sasan and cling to it so long as day and night follow one after the other, and draw off water to it from the wellspring of resolve and swear to it with the surest of oaths." Almost as if it's an order, kind of like an anti-order, if you want to think of it that way. And then next, the poet illustrates the need for everyone to rely on Sasan. And to show this, he uses a lineup of tragic historical figures whose misfortunes could have been avoided through his favor. So just to put up one or two examples, if you had been there at the invasion of Abu Yusuf, his slave wouldn't have broken trust at Tlemcen. This refers to the betrayal of and murder of the Marinid Sultan Abu Yusuf, and treachery by his slave. And Khosrow the miller, if you had known Yazdegerd, he wouldn't have been murdered at the hands of a miller. Yazdegerd was the last Sasanian king, and Khosrow the miller betrayed and murdered him, according to the narrative. And then there follows a section pleading for monetary benefit, which often happens in poetry, and a place in Sasan's memory, including nostalgia for bygone days spent at places in Al-Andalus recalled by name. So in the last section and in this section, we have examples of Iberian and North African history, Iberian and North African geography, sort of overlaying onto an Eastern Arab world genre or subgenre or mode of writing, maybe like this Banu Sasan sort of writing, which I mentioned a few examples of it in the beginning, overlaying it with Western Islamic texture. You never cease to answer my wish with bounty even before I ask it, and my sought after goal with generosity. Don't neglect the memory of pleasant days spent at the lodge of Ibn Mahrouq or the way place of Hamdan. And these are identified in medieval Arabic sources on geography as being places in the vicinity of Granada. Then, in the next section, Omar describes the sorcerer, the poet, describes the sorcerers and tricksters that the order of Sasan attracts, as well as an all-night debauch at the Andalusi Umayyad fort of Al-Qab. This is a mountain fort, and this part has these lewd verses that were Baudelarized by Al-Maqbari in one of the two anthologies. It's interesting that he didn't do it in the other one. Might have been that he, one was sort of like his draft, and then the other one he was like, you know what, we need to get rid of these. But this is just me speculating. How many of you were anxious to fasten your own waistbands, while how many of you hoped to loosen that of others? For indeed, you, Sasan, purposely snuffed out the lamp of the place and beckons to them, so they swooped down like eagles. This eagles word is a pun, Arqban, on the name of the fort, Arqab, which is the singular of eagle. So he's, making a nice pun there in the Arabic. And you called for the people to ride out, and therefore a group hurried after women and another group hurried after the men, making for what we might today call a mixed orientation rendezvous, perhaps. And then most of the remaining 28 lines make up a virtuoso literary historical performance, which is, as far as I can tell, unique among Banu Sasan literature, in which the poet begs Sasan for an ijaza certificate. This is, a certificate proving that he studied certain texts with a teacher and that he then becomes authorized to teach those texts. So he asks Sasan for an ijaza for almost 24 titles and authors. And the last 6 lines then reaffirm the poet's commitment to Sheikh Sasan. And these titles it's very interesting to see what shows up. For example, so my imam, referring to Sasan, do give me an ijaza for everything I've transmitted of Madralis, or for what I know of Ibn Huzman. Interesting, because if we think of it, Zajjal poetry isn't the sort of thing that you might put into a madrasa curriculum or something as like central to what an educated person was supposed to know. But this made it into Omar's curriculum, probably because he was a Zajjal poet and because he was known for that, and thinking like, this is the kind of thing that I'm committed to. And I've gotten good at this because I've studied the masters of Zajjal poetry, including these two gentlemen. Nor should you forget about the verses I know from Ad-Dabbagh, since the two of you are alike with respect to that verse. Ad-Dabbagh al-Ishbili, this is a Maliki jurist and a polymath who also wrote poetry. So just a couple of examples of authors who show up. He also mentions the titles of books, and they span the curriculum from literature to Islamic law, fiqh, to astrology and magic. There's a sex manual that shows up in there. Apparently it's called Kitab al-Bah, which means the book of coition or coitus. Anyway, a few takeaways as we sort of go through this very speedy summary of some of the poem. This qasida has a Western Islamic flavor, as I mentioned. There's place names, it mentions Fez and Marrakesh and other places. Historical betrayals like the treason against the Marinid Sultan Abu Yaqub Yusuf, the famous Zajjal poets I mentioned, and then this Maliki jurist in the Dabbagh al-Ishbili. Another takeaway is that this eponymous founder of this society, Sasan, is like a spirit guide. Comes up time and again, but line 9 is an example of that, and a leader of a syncretic sort of anti-order. And this goes along with Christina Richardson's point that the Benu Sasan was a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional group that consciously styled itself as a tribal nation with an eponymous founder. As I mentioned, another takeaway is that allusions to book titles give the poem an erudite feel that isn't a given in some of the poems and other literature about the Benu Sasan, that may also be an index of contemporary intellectual trends, and it's sort of maybe curriculum. And then this last question, was there an actual false praiser? Remember the title of this thing, a salvo of arrows aimed at the false praiser's vitals. Is this an actual person who tried to ingratiate himself with a ruler, one that Omar wanted to defend? Maybe the poem is a hazal-like panegyric, hazal being jesting. So, in sort of a light tone, a praise poetry to a patron who has been appointed a katib, a secretary. Then again, the protagonist may be, in the words of Van Gelder, not so much a realistic character as a protean mouthpiece of everything that undermines itself. And with that quote, I come back to the quote that I offered at the beginning from The Mischievous Muse. Maybe one thing that this poem is doing, perhaps the primary thing it's doing, is encouraging us to laugh, encouraging us not to take the poet seriously. He's undermining himself. This is a primary feature of hazal in classical Arabic texts. But it's doing so with the purpose, perhaps, to instruct us rather than by preaching to us. It's one way of thinking of it this way, and at the very least, it's good food for thought for what is a very intriguing and rich text. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Both those papers, Dwight and your paper, were really excellent. And again, Nasser couldn't make it, unfortunately. He had an emergency. So that is it for our afternoon panel. And we can take questions or comments if people have those.
If you are a participant, please put your questions into the Q&A function, and I'll read them back if you have questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So anybody, do the panelists have any questions for the panelists?
I'm not really a panelist, but can I ask the question?
I'll allow it.
Thank you. This is to Kevin. I mean, I found a lot of really valuable information in both of your talks, the Dwight and Kevin. And I can also just comment to Dwight about the cantigas images, which I use all the time. And it's really, I hadn't even thought about the fact that they weren't wearing shoes. But Kevin, I'm actually interested in I hadn't seen the study Roma in the medieval world. So, and you've defined the Banu Sasan. So is it really connecting the Roma to the Banu Sasan? Is that, and I know you defined it several times as a multi-ethnic group that self-organized and, as a tribe. And I know there's a lot of studies, about contemporary Roma and stuff as an ethnic identity, right? Like, so I don't know, is that the connection you were making, or that's made? I know you were citing someone else's scholarship.
Yeah, so I'll address that. It is the point that Cristina Richardson makes, but I'll summarize it here. What she says basically is that it's like you said, a multi-ethnic kind of tribal group, that the main thing that brings them together isn't even shared ethnicity. One thing that she says is that the title of her book, Roma in the Medieval Islamic World, represents a compromise. It's a compromise of marketability, because most people don't know the term that these people use about themselves, which are, again, strangers, ghuraba. What most people know is Roma. And you hear Roma, you think this is a more acceptable term now than gypsy, which is the traditional, often used term for these groups. What she says is that even the term Roma is a misnomer because it's just one ethnicity, and that it's because of Roma nationalism that has equated the Roma with these itinerant groups. And she says what that does is it prevents us from writing a more comprehensive, expansive study of peoples and groups who they don't identify primarily with geography or ethnicity or these other things. Primarily what they identify is as itinerants, people who reject staying in the same place, people who reject national boundaries. And this is kind of a point that's tangential to the paper that I gave, in the sense that this is a poem far removed in time from sort of these original 9th, 10th, 11th century Baghdadi texts that sort of speak about this originally. But as I mentioned, there's this Mamluk era poet, Ibrahim al-Ma'mar, who also very famously, writes in Sine dialect, or incorporates elements of it in his text. So, is it so far removed? I don't know. It's an interesting quandary. But anyway, that was just to address your point about the relationship between Roma and the Banu Sasan, which again, Roma being just one of many ethnicities that sort of got lumped in with this, if you want to think of it as a tribal confederation, and that's the relationship there.
Thanks. But so it sounds like the use in this qasida is, because a poet from Nasser, Al-Andalus could have really claimed Andalusi identity, right? Wasn't that an option? So making this kind of pivot seems like they're actually rejecting the sort of Andalusi nationalist identity. I don't know. Maybe that was your point. So I think.
Thanks. So before we get to Dwight's question, Dwight, do you have a follow-on comment, or are you starting a new question? You have a follow-on comment. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes, so I just intersect with this topic a very little bit, and I'll just add in terms of the modern existence of Sim, that my doctoral dissertation work was done with Sirat Bani Hilal epic singers, and they belong to a group that we might, or we might think of as gypsies, but they understand there to be several different tribes of what we would call gypsies. In Egypt, they belong to the Wulad Halab or the Halaba, and there's also the Nawar, and there's the Rawazi, and the language that they use to communicate among themselves when negotiating the price for performing at a wedding is a modern form of sim, and I have given several examples of this. They refer to it to external people, they refer to it as ratana, which is one of the Arabic words for gibberish. And say, oh, we're just speaking gibberish to each other. Anyway, so there is some account of the various different, whatever we want to call them, marginalized social groups. Ethnicity strikes me as too strong or too defined a word. These are marginal social groups, and there are at least a half dozen that we know from Egypt alone, let alone when you get into the into the Levant and that sort of thing. But one of the things that is shared is that they have this, whether you will call it an argot or a patois that they share. And when we line up that, when I look at my vocabulary items that I collected in the 1980s, I can compare them to vocabulary collected in the 1870s by a British author named McAllister. And we see that there is a continuity over centuries of, a certain amount of the shared vocabulary. I don't know whether my stuff goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. Cristina has done a remarkable and wonderful job of pulling together all of the older sources.
Thanks very much for this additional expansion. And we now have another question from Amina Boukail, who asks Kevin, what distinguishes the Andalusian maqamat from the maqamat from the East?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. Just to point out one or two things, again, by this point, the maqama as a genre had proliferated and ramified. So there were a bunch of different kinds by this point: philological and aesthetic maqamas, exhortatory maqamas, trying to preach, praise maqamas, and picaresque and comic, comedy maqamas are just one type. So that's one thing to point out. Another is that Pierre Kashia talks about how the word maqama, as used in Iberia, North Africa, refers to the style more than it does to like stock characters or plots that you typically associate with like the Garcia-San, especially Al-Hariri in the East. So that you find people, including Omar az-Zajjal, the poet that I'm talking about today, that they labeled them as a maqama any piece of finely wrought ornamental prose that's studded with elegant verses. So in the text that I mentioned, Omar actually, there's sort of a prose prelude to his poem, and it goes on for a bit, not quite a full page, and then the qasida starts. And in the text, I think it's al-Maqari calls it al-Maqama as-Sasaniya, which is fascinating because it's clearly a poem. There's no way that he would mistake it for a rhyming prose. I mean, the prelude is in rhyming prose, but then it's followed by a qasida, but the whole thing is called a maqama. And I tried to understand why, this is clearly at a point in Arabic literary history where, no one ever would have confused these two things anyway, at any point in Arabic literary history, but at this point in the 15th century, it's there's no way. So to try and understand why he would have even used the word maqama to describe what's clearly a qasida, it's prose versus poetry, is a very basic distinction. And this is, one answer that I came up with, which is that it perhaps is just any kind of nice, pretty prose. So anyway, just a couple of thoughts to answer your question.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So let's see, do we have any further questions for our panelists? We have time if people have questions. Please drop it in the Q&A function. This would be a great time to play that music from Jeopardy that they play. All right, Kevin, your question.
Dwight, I have a question for you about the sort of material evidence of the things that you worked on, and you worked on the stuff and really done such a tremendous job introducing everyone to so many categories and terms and other things that we don't have before. How much of this can you verify, or can anyone verify materially? I know it's a tricky question, but
Can you give me a better sense of how much of this? What is the this here?
anything you talked about.
Anything.
You
Well,
pick.
well, we have iconic evidence. We have a little bit of archaeological evidence, and so many of the things, were as I gave you just a handful of examples, but the last couple of decades have shown a huge number of new texts, some of which are actually manuscripts that are being discovered, or more like you referred to, manuscripts that are finally moving into edited editions where they are more available to the rest of us. So I think, everything that I was talking about, at least, from the text, those are indeed the texts. I mean, we do not have, I would love to find something more about these marionette performances. There are multiple references to this playing on play horses. We have Ibn Khaldun gives a nice a description of this. The Shakundi mentions this. It's actually found all over. So, and then we, as I have written in, we have descriptions of qiyan, of singing girls, female slaves who are trained singers, who are also trained performers in many different things, such as shadow puppetry. One very famous Qaina is also said to be proficient in the art of swordsmanship and knifesmanship and spears. And so it's hard to tell. We can't tell whether she actually put on displays with actual swords and and knives and this sort of thing, or whether this was some sort of dancing, because there are, for instance, dagger dances scattered all over the Middle East from Saudi Arabia to Morocco. So are these types of dances, or is this actually her engaging in fake duels, in the middle of the court? Who knows? But we have many, many references to fascinating aspects of probably a more popular type of entertainment, like the text that I showed you that Gomez Montaner has showed us about these minstrel families coming up, where the invitation is always addressed to the women. Please bring your mother and your wife and your daughters, and you to perform. So what that actually looked like, we'd love to know. But everything else, the basic descriptions, I think, is pretty well demonstrated in texts or in iconographic sources.
Thanks very much. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, so I think we can move to hear Professor Monroe's comments. I'm going to take a brief moment to just move this laptop so that I can set it up in front of him. And you want to prefer to come here? That's actually easier. Yeah. He's going to switch places. Go ahead, Michelle.
Let's see. Is Cristina Sivantos still?
She's here. Yeah.
I don't know. I know she
logged on.
She wanted to show a couple of the slides that didn't come through.
Thank you.
Cristina, did you want to?
Maybe I'll just show two if you don't mind. I realized I didn't understand what Michelle was trying to tell me, and I thought that you could still see what I had more faith in technology than I should have, and I should have asked what you could see on the screen. But let me just show you now two images so you can get a sense of the confluence of cultures in this town that I was working on. Now, can you see this image?
Yes, but it's, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So this is just to give you a sense. Oh, okay. That the town includes men in skirts, people living in yurts, and then the Sufis with their mosque on the outskirts of town that attracts a wide variety of people, most of them converts from different parts of Europe. And then there was one at the very end, that just to try and summarize some of the contrasts. The one on one side has one member of
You can,
can you see it or not?
wait, no, I just see the one with the yurt and the Sufi and the guy
geez,
walking
for
up the
some reason
street.
they don't advance. Okay. In any case, I think that suffices, but that's strange.
I
This-
don't know
the
why. it's
presentation is
doing-
not actually started. It's in, yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Now, does it go to the last one?
No, now we're seeing a slide that says Orgiva Plural.
Yeah,
Plural
plural, yeah, that's the one I wanted to show now. So just to show this is a very common scene of the, one of the members of the Sufi community at the meat counter in a local grocery store with all the jamon serrano hanging from the ceiling. And that same grocery store also sells a selection of halal meats. So there's, those are constantly side by side in the town. So that's the level of negotiation that goes on is on a very minute level where you have the halal meat next to the jamon in the same store. So that was just what I wanted to share. But thank you for giving me the chance again to show the images.
thank you. There, a question did just come in for Dwight.
Okay, yeah, we
I
do
get-
have a question for Professor Reynolds.
Yes.
Are there any recent developments with regards to Hispano-Arabic literature and the early Provençal lyrics since J.A. Abu Haidar published his book in 2001? Is the debate still alive?
The debate is still very much alive. And I have to say, I am, in my most recent two books, I basically skirt that. I am sort of opposed to focusing entirely on the question of influence and the question of origins, and find, that at times we have essentially ignored the larger tradition as a whole because we are so focused on trying to find a single origin point. If I had to weigh in on, something like the origins, as I wrote in the musical heritage of Al-Andalus, that unless some remarkable text comes to light, that really pins it down for us, we don't have a clear point of origin, and that may not matter, that we should be studying the tradition as it existed, through the centuries, and not be overly concerned. The great text that I was talking about, Dara Tiraz, of course, one of the things that's most frustrating for some modern scholars, particularly Western scholars, is that he's utterly uninterested in the origins of Muashahat. For him, it's a new and exciting development in Arabic literature and Arabic poetry and Arabic song, and he just dives in and talks about it like that. And I sort of think, well, maybe that's the attitude we should have as well. The other thing is that I've argued, I have written a few articles that deal with this and point. I have made comparisons with particularly the troubadour, the Provençal troubadour poetry and the Andalusian muashah, etc. And I guess the term that I come up with is, quite frankly, in human culture, what we oftentimes have is what I term complex genealogies, and that there are very few cultural phenomena that emerge from a single point of time or a single contact. And that music, if anything, is the most elusive of cultural expressions, right? Because even when we have texts about music, we don't have the music itself. And I give several different examples. All it takes for a melody to move from one group to the next is somebody to hear it. And then they go back to wherever they came from, and they don't have it quite exactly the way it was originally performed. They have their human memory. And if it's crossing over musical systems from an Arabic music system to a European system, then it probably gets adapted to that side. Similarly, rhythms, when people hear, we do this in ethnomusicology, we have students do these experiments where they hear a rhythm and then they try to do it. And of course, that we in the Western world are so used to things like 2, 3, and 4. If we hear a rhythm in 5, we walk away and we don't understand what that was, and we can't reproduce it. So a rhythm gets changed. And so a melody can transfer when musical instruments move. That's not proof that the music moved with it. You can take a lute, an Arab lute from, southern Spain and carry it to southern France, but it doesn't bring the music with it. So the movement of musical instruments, the diffusion of musical instruments is not proof of musical distribution or diffusion. So for the most part, we have to leave it open to speculation. And so I offer multiple different possibilities. I also give examples such as, Pope Sylvester II, who was from Provence and went down to Spain and at least went as far as Vic and Barcelona, and may or may not have studied in Arabic texts, may or may not have studied in Cordoba, came back and, had absorbed Arabic mathematics and wrote a number of texts, including one about how to tune church organs so they would be in tune based on the Arabic mathematics he had studied in Iberia. People claim that he was inspired by the devil because he could do math faster than other people, but eventually he was elected Pope, and he was the Pope in the year 1000. And I'd like to point out that the Pope in the year 1000 knew Arabic, and the Pope in the year 1100 started the Crusades. Anyway, so I think it's difficult to pin it down. It's an open question.
That's I love that answer. That's a great open-ended answer. Thank you so much. And we now have the opportunity to hear from Professor Monroe himself. So I'll invite him up to the electronic podium over here. And you'll probably want to come this way to avoid this cord. Yeah, this way. Yeah. Thank you. We'll keep talking. Right there. Huh? Yeah, I'm gonna adjust this. Yeah. I just have to sit down. Then you can. There we go. Beautiful. All right. When you're ready.
What do I do?
Just talk.
To hit?
As if it were to right.
Well, I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium, Michelle Hamilton. If she's listening, I assume she is. I hope she gets well soon. David Wacks, thank you. And Nasser Meerkhan, who is not here, I hope he gets well also. Ignacio Navarrete, thank you so much for organizing this thing. I don't know where to begin to thank you. I'd also like to talk briefly about some of my teachers who got me into this situation. I came originally from Chile, where, of course, traditionally in the school I was brought up in as a boy, the Arabs were viewed as something that to be forgotten, although there were a lot of Arab students in the class who came from Syria, particularly to Latin America. And I fell into the hands of Americo Castro in the University of Houston. He had retired from Princeton and was teaching there. When all of a sudden I heard his approach to Spanish history, this changed my whole career. And I studied for 3 years with him, and then spent a year in the University of Toulouse in France, where there was a professor who's originally Polish, Stanislas de Benda, who was he had escaped the Nazis from Poland and ended up in Toulouse with his daughter, whereas a lot of his family had been murdered in Poland. And he was teaching a course called Arabic for Hispanists, because there were a lot of Hispanists in Toulouse who had fled, liberal Spaniards who fled Franco's regime after the Civil War. So I took this class, and it was a class in first year Arabic. And that's how I started. The only difference is from normal first year Arabic was that he taught us using texts that were original Hispano-Arabic texts, so that at the same time that we were learning the language, we were learning a bit about the history. When I came back, I went to graduate school at Harvard with 1 year of Arabic, and I was in the Romance Languages department working on Spanish. But there was there a Professor Sir Hamilton Gibb, Englishman, who I went to see him, and I asked if I could take his course, his seminar on Arabic poetry. And he asked me, how many years of Arabic have you studied? So when I told him I just studied 1 year, he didn't call the police or have me thrown out. He said, why don't you take the class? Don't audit it, don't take it for credit. So I did that. Then Ukraine has been in the news an awful lot lately, and I owe my career in some respects to a Ukrainian. There was a student in the class called Yaroslav Stedkevich. And he came up to me after the first or second week, and he said, look, why don't you come to class a half an hour early, and I'll help you, and we can go over the assignment and see how it goes. So he did this for a whole year. At the end of the year, Yaroslav died recently, and so I mentioned all this in his memory. At the end of the year, Sir Hamilton Gibb said to me, now you can take it. I think you're ready to take the class for credit. And I did that for the next few years, taking his class. Many years later, Yaroslav and I were together at some meeting, and he said, you know, I never told you. Sir Hamilton Gibb called me in one day to his office and said, why don't you help this young man? So these were some of my teachers. When I was finishing up my PhD, I was, in the last year, I was offered a job here in Berkeley, in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I wrote back immediately saying, would you allow me to teach a course in Hispano-Arabic literature in your department? And they wrote back saying, no, we can't do that because this is the what the Near Eastern Studies department does, that you only have to teach Spanish literature. Simultaneously, I was offered another, the same job in the University of California, San Diego. And so I accepted because they told me that I could do anything I wanted there. And that's what I did. I taught Arabic as well as Spanish. And then eventually, after 6 years, I was offered a job in comparative literature in Near Eastern Studies here at Berkeley, so I came back up here. But since those days when the Spanish and Portuguese department didn't admit anything having to do with Arabic, although there were two scholars, John Walsh and Jerry Craddock, who were very interested in that, and they did do something about it. Since then, they have hired Nasser Meerkhan, and I am awfully sorry that he's not here. And if he is listening, I do hope he gets well soon. And so now they actually have an Arabist working in Near East, in Spanish and Portuguese, which I think is a good step forward. I would also like to thank Samuel Armistead, who was also a student of Americo Castro, along with Joseph Silverman. And they both helped me a great deal along my career when I was younger, and they helped me enormously. So their memory must be. And finally, but not lastly, I would like to thank Julianne, my wife, who for 57 years has been helping me with my Arabic. I wouldn't be here had it not been for you. Thank you. That's.
Thank you. Yeah. Would you entertain any questions if there are from the audience?
I'm going to have to read this when it comes out. I hope it will be published.
What?
I hope all these things will be published.
Oh yeah, we haven't talked about that yet, but yeah, maybe.
But if they are, then I will be able to read them more carefully.
Oh, okay. I mean, if anybody has the questions for you, I mean, if anybody has any questions for you.
Oh, if they have questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. I don't know if I can.
Yeah. So you heard the man. If you have a question, please put it into the Q&A, and he'll do his best to answer. We'll see if anybody pops up with a question for you.
No good questions.
Not just yet. Okay, I have a question for you.
Please.
Yeah. Why do you think that Islam and the Arabs has never been translated into Spanish?
I don't know. Maybe they don't like it.
Okay, that's a fair answer. Okay, well, let's see.
Maybe they could read it in English. I don't know.
Michelle, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Just when Dave and I were going through, or sort of looking at Islam and the Arabs and Spanish scholarship, it seemed like you published that and 2 other books at basically the same time, and which seems sort of like a marvel of nature, like how does that happen? So I'm just wondering if that in fact is true, if you had been sitting on them, or if you were just like a wonderkin.
No. I was sitting on the Islam and the Arabs. It was my thesis, and I put that aside. And then I wrote these 2 other monographs. They were translations, I think, Shulvia and Garcia, and then when I published first the other 2, then the thesis. What I did was this thesis. When I actually wrote my thesis, Sir Hamilton Gibb suggested to me, he said, don't mention any Arabists who are alive today. Just do the ones who are dead, because otherwise no matter what you say, you're not going to make them happy. And so I did exactly that. My thesis ended with Asim Palacios, I think, who had died, or Uribe. But then afterwards, I added to it a number. I should not have done that, but I added Garcia Gomez and a number of other people. And in the case when I published it, Gomez wrote a very nasty review of it. But you have to keep in mind that Garcia Gomez was Franco's ambassador to Turkey at the time. And Franco was sort of not exactly a very liberal ruler. What I was trying to say was that the Arabists, a certain number of Arabists in Spain were liberal people, and they were trying to open up minds. So Garcia Gomez didn't like it. But anyway, it was written before, and I just added a few chapters at the end, so that it wasn't something I had to completely rewrite. So that's why they all came out at the same time, more or less.
Oh, here's a question from Dwight. Do you have any explanation for why Garcia Gomez rejected the musical aspects of the Muashi tradition so vehemently?
I just think he probably didn't know anything about music. I don't know. He was a literary scholar, basically.
Okay.
If I can jump in, I find, these comments that he made, that Ibn Sina al-Mulk was exaggerating and that he was ignorant and he was incompetent, just astonishing from any modern scholar.
Right.
Doing an edition and a translation of a medieval author. I mean, who are we to say that this person, didn't understand what they were writing about?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So you think it's purely that because he had no musical training and that he,
probably.
Right.
Probably.
Yeah. All right.
But these are songs, basically. That's the whole point.
Exactly.
In fact, I was just working the other day on a Zajal by Ibn Qusman. And Ibn Qusman, in that Zajal, he says, I will sing my Zajal. So, and that's not the only, there are 4 or 5 of them in which he refers to singing his Zajals. So these were songs, not simply poems.
Exactly. Well, I offer you my personal thanks for having stood up and been the champion of the musical tradition of Zajal and Muashi in face of much, what shall we say, resistance in other areas from other scholars.
This came to me because years ago, an English scholar, David Woolston, came to visit Berkeley. He spent a year as a visitor in the Near Eastern department. And at the time, we got to know each other, and he opened my horizons to this aspect. He pointed it all out to me. So I owe him this thing. It's true. Basically, most of us Orientalists are not musicologists. And so we're looking at it as poetry, not as a song. But I think it was, I have to say that thanks to David Woolston, I was able to see this dimension of it.
That's very interesting to hear. David Woolston is certainly a remarkable character in more ways than one.
Okay. Great. Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Professor Monroe for these comments, and that brings us to the end of our program. So, Michelle, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
No, I found all the presentations were really wonderful, and it was really great to see people virtually, if not in person. So, and thanks to everyone, and special thanks to the center for arranging all this, and to Nasser. And I'm really sorry he couldn't be here because he's done a lot of work to make this happen. And also again to Ignacio and to you, David. So, and to all the presenters. So
yeah, and thanks to everybody who tuned in from abroad and in the interwebs. It's great to have you with us, and sorry we couldn't have you here in person, but maybe next time for the 100th anniversary of the publication of the book, we'll do it. So everyone, be well, and hopefully we'll see you at the next thing. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Thanks to all of you.